The awkward 14-year-old girl was his little sister, Rain. And indeed, it wasn't a coincidence that Sonny had bought this exact house in this exact district of the city. While the terrace neighborhood was nice and charming, the real reason he had chosen this home, in particular, was because it stood next to the place where Rain lived. It was on this street, a year and a few months ago, that he had watched from the shadows as she was having dinner with her adopted family. Their warm and happy life displayed for him to see through the wide window of their brightly illuminated living room. Well, now Sonny had a living room and a wide window of his own, even though there was usually only darkness behind it. Back then, he had become painfully aware that his fantasy of saving his little sister was empty and misguided. Rain didn't need to be saved, least of all by a troubled outskirt stray like him, a ghost of the past that she most likely did not even remember. If he had knocked on her door on that night, nothing in her life would have changed for the better. Sonny wasn't the same penniless kid anymore. He was an awakened one marked as a special strategic asset by the government. He was considerably wealthy, connected, even powerful, but deep down he still believed that the statement held true. His clothes and circumstances might have changed, but Sonny himself remained the same, twisted and damaged. Like anyone who had seen the truth of this world would be. What's worse, now that he had risen above his previous pathetic self, he had a whole swarm of new, much more serious problems. Nephi's, the sovereigns, the legacy of the mysterious weaver, all of these things promised a future full of turmoil and danger. He was not exactly the kind of person who had good things to offer to anybody. So no, Sonny had not changed his mind about keeping himself out of Rain's life. He wasn't going to approach her and had no desire to meet her face to face. There was, however, a problem. Now that Sonny was an awakened statistically, Rain's chances of becoming infected by the nightmare spell herself had grown. But even if he forgot about that statistical correlation, there was still a possibility that she would end up in the first nightmare, no matter how small. By now, Sonny was 18 and Rain was 14. Almost every person infected by the spell had fallen victim to it while being older than 16 and younger than 19. Which meant that there were about 2 years left before Rain would be in real danger, and about 4 before she would be out of it. Even if they were more or less strangers and didn't owe anything to each other, Sonny felt responsible for her. Perhaps Rain did not remember him due to how little she had been at the time of their separation, but he remembered everything. To him, she was the last memento of their long-lost home. Now that he had the ability to pull some strings behind the scenes to ensure that her chances of surviving the first nightmare were enhanced, be it through access to better battle instructors or something else, he couldn't just sit still and do nothing. But to do that, he first needed to understand how well Rain was being prepared already. Hence, he bought a house near the place where she lived and let his shadows loose to explore the neighborhood and spy on her and her family. Sonny muttered that when he put it that way, it sure sounded a bit creepy. Sonny stood up, yawned, and shrugged. He was an awakened whose power lay in shadows, deceit, and bloodshed. Before that, he was a street rat willing to do anything in order to survive. Mundane humans had no idea about what he had gone through, what he had done, and what he was capable of as the result. If they did, they would probably be horrified. So, a little hint of creepiness was only to be expected. Putting on a warm hoodie, he walked outside, hid his hands in his pockets, and headed toward the public transport terminal at a slow pace. His shadow was a few hundred meters ahead, stealthily following Rain and keeping an eye on her. No one was the wiser to its presence. Sonny sighed and looked at the cloudy sky, then muttered that it was time to go to school, he guessed. Rain went to a rather elite school, as it turned out. Judging by the prices of the homes in the Terrace district, Sonny knew that her adopted family was reasonably well-to-do, but it seemed that he had underestimated either their wealth or their connections. The school was not the most prestigious out there, but it was close, enough that only the kids of government officials and conglomerate heirs attended it, for the most part, of course. There were a few kids who seemed to be there because of their academic achievements, but not enough to make a difference. The children of government servants arrived on public transport, like Rain. The chaebals came in expensive PTVs, which were controlled by personal drivers. Sitting at a table in a cafe a kilometer or so away from the heavily guarded entrance to the school, Sonny suppressed the desire to whistle. He remarked that it was like something out of a drama, and wondered if he would see someone getting slapped in the face today. Suddenly remembering his first encounter with Master Jet, Sonny coughed and rubbed his cheek in embarrassment. The happy shadow was still following Rain, stealthily moving from one shadowy patch to another. Then, it waited for a good opportunity and dove inside the shadow of one of the kids walking toward the same classroom as her. Sonny got comfortable and ordered a few pastries and a pot of tea. He couldn't quite believe that he was going to waste time attending school, of all things, even if it was in that very strange manner. He hadn't been to school in a dozen years already, not counting the months spent in the academy. He mused that this should be interesting. Sonny settling in with tea to spy on a school he never expected to attend is its own kind of entertainment. Hit like on this episode to help more people find the story. A couple of hours later, Sonny was ready to claw his eyes out. Not because the lessons taught to Rain in school were boring, but because he had to watch a bunch of entitled kids exist in an enclosed space and make it as hard for everyone to learn anything as possible. The elite school seemed like a place of learning, but in fact, it was more like a battlefield. The hidden politics among the students and the hierarchy of numerous cliques they formed were more complex than the ruthless strife between the factions in the Bright Castle, and judging by their behavior, just as dire. But it was not. No one's life was at stake, and no one was going to be exiled and starved to death if they did a wrong thing. All of this was simply about prestige, vanity, and standing. It was utterly stupid. However, once Sonny thought about it a bit more, he realized that it was not. Not to them, and maybe not at all. These kids were put under immense pressure, assigned a numerical value, and forced to compete with each other. As the result, they inevitably developed a fierce sense of resentment toward their rivals, which was only made deeper by the deep sense of insecurity this system instilled in them. No wonder they were at each other's throats. The school was, in fact, not only meant to teach the kids the skills necessary to survive and thrive in the real world, but also to destroy the very same softness Sonny had pondered about a few hours earlier. It wasn't hard to imagine that, at the end of it all, the best and most resilient students would become harsh and jaded, while the rest would simply be broken and discarded. A wasteful system, and one of very questionable effectiveness. Sipping tea in the quiet cafe, Sonny shook his head and muttered about rich people. Luckily for him, Rain seemed to be unaffected by the vitriol her classmates seemed to be more interested in than the actual studying. She sat calmly at the back of the class, avoiding getting embroiled in any drama, and dutifully learned everything the teachers explained to the students. The lessons themselves, surprisingly, turned out to be very interesting. Sonny even found himself enjoying these hours very much. There had not been any combat lessons yet, but he did manage to catch this school's version of the wilderness survival course, as well as listen to a rather intriguing lecture about the early exploration of the dream realm. He also saw a lesson dedicated to various nightmare creatures, their biology, capabilities, and weaknesses. If he had known that much during his first months on the Forgotten Shore, well, it would not have changed much, really. No matter how much a person knew about these things. No sleeper was meant to face challenges of that magnitude. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a bit wistful. He had been denied access to this treasury of knowledge as a kid. Who knew how his life would have turned out otherwise? It would have been a lot more interesting and enjoyable, at least. By then, he had some idea of Rain's depth of knowledge and overall readiness for the nightmare spell, but he still did not know how well she was really being trained. He had to see her during a lesson in combat for that. After a while, Sonny had become a little bit bored. Listening to a lecture about spelltech absent-mindedly, he looked around the cafe. At this hour, there weren't a lot of people there, but that was swiftly changing. The white-collar workers from the surrounding buildings were now on their lunch break, as were senior students of the school. Several noisy groups were occupying tables near him, so he couldn't help but catch bits and pieces of their conversations. Someone exclaimed in disbelief, asking when a film was coming out. Another guessed it was in a couple of months. A third wondered who would play the female lead, then cut themselves off, wanting to guess. These guys were apparently discussing some upcoming film, excitedly wondering about the casting. Something about their conversation appeared strange to Sonny, but he didn't pay it too much attention. Then one of them declared that having no mindset at all was the mindset of a true battle master. Another disagreed, insisting that Lord Mongrel was no nobody, and that he only said that because he considered social status and renown meaningless. In the eyes of a warrior, such things were not even worth mentioning. The only thing that mattered was strength, which was why he hid his noble upbringing. Sonny stared at the couple of young men that were in the middle of a heated debate, then shook his head and muttered that it was hilarious and wondered what the chances were. Apparently, there was somewhere else out there with a similar alias. And that guy, from what Sonny could hear, was not only a total buffoon, but also went around calling himself a lord, pretending to be some wise philosopher and teaching people how to be a true warrior. Sonny grumbled that the guy was an idiot, but figured it made sense, since only an idiot would choose such an alias on purpose. He wondered what the fellow's problem was, and concluded he had to be horribly insecure about something for sure. Then, however, he had to focus on Rain again because she was finally heading for the school's dojo. The combat lesson was about to begin. The instructor, surprisingly, turned out to be an actual awakened. It was a man in his late 30s, with a mighty build and cold eyes of an experienced fighter. Sonny couldn't tell what aspect the man possessed. But he was obviously not a sheltered non-combatant. Rain's instructor was the real deal. He had to have enough money to never be required to work a single day in the real world. So the fact that he was teaching a bunch of kids in a school meant that he was doing it either because of his principles or because of an obligation to one of their parents. In any case, it was a good thing for Rain. In the next hour or so, Sonny watched the students train and fight each other with various weapons. He expected them to use fake ones, but to his surprise, the awakened instructor insisted that the kids both wore heavy protective gear and wielded real ones, even if the weapons were blunted to not pose a real danger. Sonny conceded that it was a good approach he guessed. Rain's level was better than he had expected. Not comparable to someone like Castor or Nephi's, of course, but miles better than anything he would have been able at her age. She was swift, nimble, and strategic, utilizing every opening the opponent presented to her full advantage. She seemed to prefer using ranged combat, but could hold her own in a melee with the help of a wide range of weapons, from a long spear to a light saber. There were kids who were better than her, and those who were worse, but none who could compare to her in terms of wits. And yet, a deep frown appeared on his face. He observed that there was one thing that was lacking: viciousness. His sister was not nearly vicious enough. Judging that he had seen everything he needed to, Sonny rose and left the cafe, then headed home. The happy shadow left the premises of the school unnoticed, and soon wrapped itself around his body, but not before showing how proud and satisfied it was with its flawless performance. Sonny muttered for it to know that it had done well. On his way back, Sonny was thinking over what he had learned about Rain. His sister seemed to be smart and well-adjusted, and receiving the kind of training most kids in this world could only dream about. But was it enough? He did not know. No one could know, really. After he had returned from the Forgotten Shore, several people told him that they would have never survived in that hell. But their words rang hollow to Sonny, because how would they know? Until a person was thrown into a situation like that, there was no way to tell what would remain of their resolve once everything else was stripped away. Brave people broke, while cowardly ones found strength that they had not even known was inside them. Kind people became cruel, while cruel people became lost. Only by looking at a mirror of a nightmare could one truly see their real face. Before Sonny entered the Forgotten Shore, he had thought himself to be strong. But once there, he had to learn the hard way that his strength was brittle and illusory, that it could shatter under the smallest amount of pressure. To survive, he had to build within himself a new kind of strength, one that could not be broken by anything or anyone. That was how he had survived. How was he supposed to know how Rain would measure against the horrors of the spell? And how was he supposed to make her chances of surviving its trials better? Consumed by these thoughts, Sonny returned home and tried to put his mind at ease. This was not something that he could decide in a hurry anyway. For now, he had many other things to do, Activating the dreamscape pod, Sunny climbed inside and closed his eyes. He sighed that it was time to relax a little. At least out there in the dreamscape things were simple. He just had to fight, learn, and win. Granted, his previous visit to the Colosseum had turned out to be a fiasco. But Sunny had high hopes for more elite arenas. He just had to gain enough victories to enter them, about 70 more to gain access to the lower-ranked professional dreams. Not that hard. He had lost all interest in dueling with amateurs, and couldn't wait to meet better opponents who could teach him a variety of polished styles. Sunny muttered that he had better do it quickly. Appearing on the sand of the Colosseum, Sunny sighed behind the mask and willed the soul serpent to assume the form of the somber Odachi. He muttered that that was weird. For some reason today, much more people wanted to challenge him. A literal crowd of awakened assembled around Sunny in a span of a minute, staring at him with disturbing intensity. Also, the challengers seemed to be way more talkative. Sunny grumbled, wondering what was up with these fools. Someone called out asking what his real name was. Sunny stared at the young woman challenging him, then answered with slight irritation that it was Mongrel. She smiled knowingly as though struck by a mysterious epiphany, then asked what style he practiced. Sunny frowned behind the mask and replied that he practiced no style. The girl opened her mouth to say something else, but he interrupted her by stepping forward and activating the challenge. 2 seconds later, the girl's dead body was already turning into a rain of sparks. Sunny muttered, wondering why they were so chatty today and noting that he didn't have a lot of time. If he wanted to enter a professional arena next time, he had to be fast. Looking at the crowd of awakened, Sunny sighed dejectedly and growled that words were worthless and silence was gold, and told them not to waste his breath. The challengers looked at each other with weirdly enlightened expressions, then grew quiet. Sunny muttered that that was better, and that at least they were an understanding bunch. Now that people seemed to have lost their desire to chat uselessly before every damn duel, things went much faster. Sunny had no plans of copying the styles of these talented amateurs today, so he could be as efficient as possible. It required him to really exert himself, though. They were all awakened, after all, each and every one of them. Behind the black mask, Sunny was sweating an ocean and silently whispering curses. But what could he do? He just had to get it done. Because he took no breaks between the duels, his reserves of shadow essence grew dangerously low at some point. Sunny was forced to command the soul serpent to return to his body to accelerate the accumulation of essence and slow down its expenditure, noticing that he had dismissed his sword. The challengers assumed that he wasn't going to fight anymore and sighed with disappointment. Glancing at them, Sunny gritted his teeth and barked for the next one to step up. He was not that far from accomplishing his goal for today, and the mantle of the underworld was like a weapon itself, especially if he manipulated its weight to make his blows carry the weight of a mountain, metaphorically speaking. His aching muscles protested, but he endured the torment and continued. Sunny muttered that it was just a few more. As the next challenger stepped forward, Sunny dashed toward him, deflected the glancing blow of a spiked mace with a vambrace, and struck the young man in the face with all the strength he could muster. The black onyx gauntlet grew terribly heavy as it flew through the air, connected solidly, and caused the young man's skull to explode, more or less. Sunny secretly panted and cursed, gasping that he couldn't keep this up much longer. Luckily, he only had a few more duels to win. About an hour after he had entered the Colosseum, Sunny finally reached enough victories to qualify for a better arena. By then, he was so tired that he felt like throwing up. Sunny groaned that goddammit, that was incredibly tough, but it was all in a day's work, he guessed. Throwing one last glance at the crowd of silent awakened, Sunny shook his head and muttered about what a bunch of weirdos they were. With that, he gave the dreamscape the command and left the illusion, both exhausted and satisfied with his progress. Left alone on the sand of the Colosseum, the challengers remained quiet for a few minutes. After a while, one of them said that he had shaken his head. Another awakened sighed heavily, then said in a solemn tone that yes, they were not worthy enough. Sunny crawled out of the simulation pod and lay on the cold floor for a while, breathing heavily. He muttered, wondering how an illusory arena could be so exhausting. The designers of the dreamscape were really weird. The people who frequented the Colosseum were even weirder, though. Sonny couldn't even begin to understand the quirks of their behavior. He mused that that was how subcultures were, he guessed. After a while, he stood up and went upstairs to make himself some food and replenish all the energy he had spent during this intense and taxing hour. Sonny made himself a light dinner, devoured it with wolfish hunger, and then relaxed in a chair while drinking a cup of delicious tea. As he rested, his communicator buzzed. He took a sip of tea, then opened the message Effie had sent him.
Hey doofus, have you seen this? I think I found a new boyfriend for your girlfriend.
The message ended with a winking emote and an attached video link. Perplexed, Sonny clicked on the link and spit out all of his tea. Forgetting to wipe his chin, he stared at the holographic screen in front of him with wide eyes, sputtering and demanding to know what the hell that was. The video was of him, of his duel in the dreamscape to be precise. Caught in stunning quality, the recording of his short duel against the young man in azure armor was playing on a loop set to menacing and epic music. The caption read, "Mongrel victorious." Sonny stared at it for a while, then slowly lowered his gaze and looked at the view count beneath the video. He stammered that there were 7 zeros. Was that Leo Stryker guy someone famous? Sonny only came to his senses because of the pressure of his flaw. Gritting his teeth, he sent Effie a short message saying that he had not seen this. He wondered what the hell was happening. Feeling apprehensive, he went on the network and typed Mongrel Dreamscape in the search bar. Immediately, thousands upon thousands of results showed, all featuring the fearsome image of Weaver's mask. Sonny gulped and muttered, "Oh no, oh no." He opened the first link and almost spat blood. The headline proclaimed that Mongrel had defeated Leo Stryker, Taoist Safer, and the Fool in 3 strikes. The short montage of a bunch of his duels played. This one had even more views. Sonny sputtered that didn't even make sense and asked whether those two were famous as well and what 3 strikes since he had hit the second guy twice. Feeling an approaching headache and a bit of panic, he scrolled through the feed, growing paler and paler with each second. There were countless videos, captions, and discussions. Thousands of people were fervently debating his duels, his identity, and the hidden meaning of his words. It seemed as though they had somehow become convinced that he was some sort of a profound sage going around spouting words of enlightened wisdom. There were whole discussion boards dedicated to interpreting his teachings. Sonny groaned, "Oh no." Sonny grabbed his head, realizing that the buffoon he had heard being discussed in the cafe was him, come to think of it. Many of Rain's classmates had been talking about this stuff, too. Had she seen this garbage as well? He groaned. At least no one seemed to have any idea about who Mongrel was. His efforts to obfuscate his identity were working, as was Weaver's mask. But the worst was still to come. As Sonny was studying the mess he had made, new notifications started appearing in the feed. One proclaimed that Mongrel had returned. Another announced that Mongrel had decimated the Colosseum. A third declared 70 victories in 60 minutes, Lord Mongrel's shocking rampage. Yet another insisted that Mongrel was a certain saint's bastard son, confirmed. He closed his eyes and muttered, asking the gods what this crap was. Opening a random link, he read in horror. One user, Mongrel #1 sympathizer, claimed he had been there and that it was incredible that Mongrel was like a natural disaster so awesome. Another user, Random Shoe, asked whether he had heard what Mongrel said. The sympathizer replied that the words were worthless and silence was gold. So profound, and that his whole outlook on life had changed. Random Shoe responded that his dad used to say the same thing when he tried to talk to him after school. The sympathizer then asked if Shoe was Mongrel's son. Random Shoe changed his name to Mongrel's son and declared that weren't they all Mongrel's children. Sonny closed the link and went to another page. This one was titled, "Silence is gold. 1 strike of a sword is worth more than 1,000 words." An in-depth analysis of the post-neo-nihilist philosophy of Mongrel. Sonny stammered, "Post-neo, what?" Stupefied, he opened another link. It was a reaction video titled, "Reacting to Mongrel's 70 wins, you gasp, you lose." And another, quoting Mongrel as saying he did not believe in styles, that styles only separate men. And another titled, "I spent a night with Mongrel, a candid confession of a former idol trainee." Deactivating the communicator, He sat quietly for a while and then groaned again. Oh no. The new recording of Mongrel's stunning performance in the Colosseum flew around the globe in no time at all. Starved for new information about the mysterious demonic fighter, people became glued to the screens of their communicators. They were not disappointed by what they saw, to say the least. Mongrel's already considerable renown or infamy, depending on who you asked, became even more widespread. Sonny had grown up in the outskirts, so he had never been really exposed both to the network culture and to the peculiar fanbase of the dreamscape. That was why he had severely underestimated the effect his recent visit to the amateur arena would have on the people interested in these things. He had only wanted to reach the number of victories required to access the professional duels as fast as possible, but failed to take into account how outstanding the feat of defeating 70 opponents in just 1 hour would look from the side. Especially considering the fact that he had killed the last half a dozen or so with his bare hands, not even bothering to use a weapon. These last few duels looked especially striking, impressive, and gruesome. If before people called Mongrel a sword demon, now he had become just a demon in their eyes. What's worse, even though it took all of his power and lots of effort for Sonny to achieve these victories, due to the fact that his face was always hidden behind the fearsome mask, he appeared to be completely calm and indifferent, as though defeating so many people in a row was nothing to him. A walk in the park, added to the fact that he had dismissed his sword near the end of the hour and then left after shaking his head. It seemed as though Mongrel was not only a demon, but also held all the rest of the duelists in utter contempt. Mongrel was disappointed in them. That disappointment ignited a fire in the hearts of many duelists of the dreamscape, pushing them to train harder, reach higher, become stronger. Mongrel's status was always in front of them, reminding these young men and women what they were striving to achieve. The name, Mongrel; the victories, 100; the defeats, 0. And of course, all of them continued to wonder about his true identity. Very soon someone made a logical connection. An incredibly talented young warrior appeared in the dreamscape soon after the 100 survivors of the Forgotten Shore returned to the real world, putting every awakened there to shame. Obviously, Mongrel was one of these 100 heroes, but which one? It didn't take people a lot of time to solve the mystery. On one of the discussion boards on the network, an anonymous user wrote, asking who among the best of the Forgotten Shore warriors also had a big reason to keep his identity a secret. Another answered, realizing that it was right in front of them the whole time. And then, the shocking piece of news spread through the network like wildfire. Mongrel's true identity was Kai of Nightingale. A news title on the screen of his communicator read that the Nightingale Representative Agency had published an official statement, declaring that the popular idol and fashion icon Knight was not the controversial dreamscape sensation, nor had he ever participated in any scandalous activities under the alias Mongrel. Sonny read it and covered his face with a hand, groaning, "Oh gods! How did poor Kai end up being involved in this mess? Had the world gone completely insane?" He stared at the message icon at the bottom of the screen nervously, half expecting to receive an angry message from his friend. Or was it up to Sonny to apologize in advance? Kai had seen him purchasing the mantle of the underworld, after all. Even though the onyx armor did not look the same as it had before being repaired and turning from pure stone to the strange stone-like metal, there was a possibility that he would recognize it. Sonny muttered, wondering why life was so hard. Sonny shook his head resentfully and stared at the ceiling. And then there was the issue of Rain. Sonny had watched her walk home through the eyes of the shadow and was once again consumed by uncertainty. Did he need to intervene? What was the best way to help her? Did she even require his help? There was no easy answer to any of these questions. He turned off the communicator, sat in the darkness for a while, then stood up and went to the kitchen, retrieving all the things that could spoil quickly from the ruined refrigerator. Sonny cooked himself a decadent dinner and ate in tense silence. He thought to himself that to hell with this, he would deal with all these problems after returning from the shipwreck island. It shouldn't take him that long to reach it, investigate, and come back anyway. A week at most. Why waste time on all this nonsense when there was a treasure waiting for him in the dream realm? Sunny had already retrieved all the pertinent information he could find from the Academy database. All awakened had some level of access to the base of shared knowledge about the dream realm and the nightmare creatures, and due to his position as the research assistant assigned to the wilderness survival faculty, he had more than most. It wasn't really enough to venture on such a dangerous expedition, but at least it gave him a basic understanding of what to expect. The rest he was going to have to learn from the people in the sanctuary who had actual experience of traversing those parts of the chained isles. And then there was also Cassie. She could help him even more. With a dark grimace, Sunny washed the plates, spent a few moments admiring their design and craftsmanship, then went about preparing himself for a long stay in the dream realm. Soon, he entered the basement, activated the maximum level of security measures, and climbed into the steel coffin of the sleeping pod. As the lid of the sarcophagus closed, he sighed and thought that 1 week would be enough, and bet everyone would forget all about this mongrel idiocy in a week. His gloomy shadow dejectedly shook its head. It took Sunny a whole day to talk to everyone he needed to talk to and gather enough information about the shipwreck island and the routes he could take to reach it. As it turned out, the journey promised to be even more perilous than he had expected. Awaken did not usually go that far into the wilderness of the Chained Isles alone, and even established cohorts were reluctant to venture this close to the tier. The nightmare creatures out there were ferocious and powerful, and the islands themselves presented more danger than here on the edges of the region. Those people did not have his aspect, though. Sunny did not consider himself to be more powerful than a full cohort of experienced awakened would be, but his powers were tailored perfectly for scouting, traversal, and escape. Even if he was going to find himself facing an overwhelming foe, he was reasonably certain of his ability to at least run away. Plus, he had Saint. The taciturn demon was worth half a cohort alone and by herself. As the sun was crawling down from the heights of the sky above, he found himself in his room, studying the makeshift map of the Chained Isles. On it, Sunny had marked the potential routes to the Shipwreck Isles, as well as known dangers he would face on the way. Of course, such a map was not completely reliable. Nightmare creatures tended to migrate and travel between islands to escape the crushing, but the really terrifying ones tended to stay put. Even taking into account that some of the places he wanted to go through could turn out to be inaccessible due to entering the ascent phase, Sunny was more or less sure that he could reach the Shipwreck Island in 3 to 4 days while remaining comparatively safe. With one exception. No matter how he looked at it, he was going to have to traverse an island known among the inhabitants of the sanctuary as the Reckoning. Not much was known about that place, except for the fact that several cohorts lost members there, while others had not come back at all. Apparently, the creature that inhabited the island was especially twisted and deadly, and was capable of messing with a person's sight. No one really knew what it was, however. All that Sunny was able to find out was that the creature was most likely not corrupted. People were under the impression that it was of the fallen rank, but had different opinions on what its class was exactly. It didn't seem to be a tyrant, at least. Sunny muttered that he could fight perfectly well even if it played tricks with his sight, and it wasn't as though he had to defeat it or even fight it, really. He could just slip past and be on his way. With a sigh, he rolled the map up and placed it in his pack. There was already a bit of food and a few supplies for a prolonged journey there. Sunny couldn't take too much with him, since there was a rather small limit on the weight of things he could pull with himself into the shadows. He could also only do so with inanimate objects, at least for now. He had no idea if that was going to change in the future. Finally, he opened his chest and took out the fang he had retrieved from the dead chain worm on the Iron Hand Island. Sunny stared at the fang for a long time, a dark expression on his face. Cassie was going to visit the sanctuary soon. With this thing and her affinity to revelations, Sunny could make his expedition much safer, not to mention increase his chances of actually discovering the treasure. Or he could avoid having to ask her for help and take much more risk with no guarantee of success. After a while, Sunny threw the fang back into the chest and closed the lid, muttering that he would rather die honestly. With a grim smile, he locked the chest, picked up his pack, and headed to the exit. As the sun rolled into the dark embrace of the sky below and disappeared, he left the safety of the sanctuary behind, approached the edge of the island, and jumped toward one of the heavenly chains. Sunny traveled northwest, trying to cover as much distance during the night as he could. He rushed across gargantuan chains as a swift shadow, soared up onto the island, traversed them on foot, and dove into the darkness once he reached the other side. He was moving across the chained aisles with enviable speed, but still not as fast as someone capable of flight would. Using Shadow Step expended up a lot of shadow essence, so he had to replenish it often to continue riding the heavenly chains. That, however, put him in a lot of danger. The islands were teeming with nightmare creatures of all kinds as well as deadly natural, well, unnatural really, threats. Sunny had to remain cautious at all times, keeping one shadow wrapped around his body while the other scouted ahead. He hid in the shadows to avoid fighting with wandering abominations, or if there was no other choice, teleported away. These jumps, however, only served to devour more of his essence, forcing him to rest and circulate it through the coils of the soul serpent as he waited for his cores to fill up. Most of the time, he didn't feel like there was a real threat to his life. Sunny's combination of attributes and abilities made him a very hard prey to hunt. No matter what kind of a horror tried, he always managed to slip away. For now, at least. As long as he did not venture into the territory of the really terrifying nightmare creatures. Like those corrupted fiends that claimed some of the islands or the beings that dwelled on the dark side of them, he was going to be all right for as long as he managed his essence carefully, against those powerful abominations, though even being a shadow was not a guarantee of safety. He still remembered the 2 ghostly torches in the dungeon beneath the ruined cathedral in the dark city. On his way, Sunny visited many islands that he had already explored before, and some that he never had a reason to visit. Each was lethal in its own way and hid alluring mysteries, most of which were bound to turn out to be nothing but inescapable traps, of course. He suppressed his curiosity and moved past. With 2 skies full of bright stars, the chained aisles were stunning at night. Even while rushing forward and hiding from the abominations populating this breathtaking and terrible land, Sunny couldn't help but marvel at its dark beauty. But beautiful things were the most dangerous. By now, he had learned that lesson all too well. At dawn, Sunny finally reached the island that was supposed to be the first stop on his journey. It was a desolate place where nothing lived, with rocky ground and plenty of small impact craters that had been left behind by the debris on the neighboring island. The chains holding that island in place had broken once, a long time ago. As the result, not restrained by anything, it soared high into the sky and eventually fell apart, ripped to pieces by the crushing. Its remaining neighbor was not of any particular interest to Sunny, but it was a good place to rest and catch his breath. Hiding in one of the craters, Sunny ate a miserly breakfast and drank from the endless spring. Then, he looked at the rising sun, studied his map for a few minutes, and summoned Saint. As the taciturn demon stepped out of his shadow at enough of a distance to not subject him to the soul-eroded effect of the broken oath, of course Sunny glanced at her. Tiredly rubbed his face and said that he was going to sleep and asked her to stand watch. The shadow stared at him indifferently for a second, then knocked an arrow on the string of her bow and turned away. Sunny sighed. He could do without sleep for a couple more days, but it was wise to keep himself in the best possible shape. One never knew what could happen in the dream realm after all. Using his pack as a pillow, Sunny lay down and closed his eyes, muttering that it was just a few hours. A day later, he reached the Reckoning. The ominous island that so many people in the sanctuary dreaded was large, spanning no less than 12 kilometers across. What's worse, it was supported by only 2 chains, which were situated almost exactly opposite of each other. To get to the next one, Sunny had no choice but to travel the whole length of the island. There was grass covering the ground with a forest of tall evergreen trees visible in the distance. He could see a rocky hill far away, with a waterfall rushing from a weathered cliff. Just like everywhere on the chained aisles, it was unclear where the water came from and where it went. Sunny was already used to the strangeness of this land to pay it any attention. The Reckoning seemed like a beautiful and tranquil place, idyllic even. However, looking at it through the eyes of the shadow, Sunny couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. Something was very wrong with this place. It was very picturesque, however. He couldn't see or hear any living beings on the island. There was no sound other than the rustle of the wind, no movement other than the slow swaying of the trees. There were no beasts, no insects, no anything. Not a single nightmare creature could be seen wandering the expanse of the peaceful island. What could be so terrible that even nightmare creatures did not dare to come to this place? Or had they been slaughtered by the owner of the island? If so, where were the bones, or bone dust at least? He thought to himself that he didn't like this. Initially, Sunny thought of traversing the reckoning in his usual manner on foot, but now he changed his mind. It was better to waste an additional amount of shadow essence than to risk meeting the ruler of this ominous place face to face, if it had a face. With a frown, Sunny used Shadow Step to leave the heavenly chain and appear on the surface of the island, near the shadow he had sent to take a look at it. Sunny did not assume physical form, preferring to remain incorporeal. That way, he would be able to reach the other side of the reckoning unseen. He muttered, wondering where that terrible creature was anyway. He couldn't see any hint of it anywhere. Full of grim apprehension, he slowly moved through the deep shadows that were cast by the tall trees of the evergreen forest. No matter how hard Sunny looked, he didn't notice any movement near him. It was as though the fallen abomination that gave the island its name, Reckoning, simply disappeared. Sunny muttered that maybe it couldn't be seen. Sunny cut off his vision and concentrated on the shadow sense. His perception of shadows came into focus, reaching far and wide. And there, Sunny gasped, demanding to know what that was. There was one shadow in particular that didn't belong to anything, approaching him with terrible speed. Sunny hissed that the bastard was invisible. Sunny froze, becoming absolutely still. In this state, he was not only one of the shadows, but also indistinguishable from the larger shadow he was hiding in. He didn't possess a physical body, so nothing was supposed to be able to hurt him in that state, at least physically. The invisible creature continued to move in his direction, even faster than before. Sunny muttered, waiting, and saying that something didn't make sense. Even if the abomination was invisible, why was there no sound? Why didn't grass bend beneath its feet? It was almost as though the nightmare creature that dwelt on the reckoning was, really, a shadow. Before Sunny could react, the owner of the reckoning was upon him, and then he learned that shadows, too, could feel pain. Sunny had never fought in his shadow form, and really, he didn't even know how. All he had were his instincts, but that wasn't enough. In fact, trusting your instincts too much was a sure way to get yourself killed. Intelligence was the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal of a human, and it was Sunny's mind that ended up saving his life. He had realized that his enemy was not invisible, but a shadow just like him only a moment before the creature was upon him. In that split second, Sunny managed to come up with the only way to escape death. As sharp pain pierced his entire being, he lunged forward and escaped the shadows, rolling away on the grass. Jumping to his feet, Sunny staggered and clutched at his side, blood flowing between his fingers, and let out a pained groan. The shadow of the unknown abomination lunged in pursuit and swiped uselessly across his body, not causing him any harm. It was just a shadow, after all. Throwing a glance at the thin tear in the puppeteer's shroud and a deep wound beneath it, Sunny took a step back. Simultaneously, he gave his shadows a command to hide themselves under his armor and augment his body. Physical attacks couldn't harm shadows, but shadows also had no way to harm living beings. That was the thought that had saved him. If he had failed to assume the shape of a human in time, he would have been dead by now, most likely, because he had not, however. He and the shadow creature were now at a standstill. The master of the Reckoning Island tried to attack him several more times, each strike ending up as fruitless as the previous ones. Then it froze, as though slightly confused by the situation. Sunny finally had a chance to take a good look at the hostile shadow. It looked just like a shadow would, like a dark, ethereal silhouette of a person painted on the grass in black. The creature seemed to have 2 legs, 2 hands, and 1 head. If Sunny didn't know what it really was, he would have assumed that the shadow was cast by an ordinary person. There was no one else in sight, though. backing away and grimacing because of the pain radiating from the deep wound in his side. Sonny stared at the enemy and thought feverishly that no, this was wrong. A shadow creature was indeed deadly for someone like him, but to every other human on the chained aisles, it was completely harmless. How was it, then, that so many people had been killed by it? And what about the nightmare creatures? How had the shadow slaughtered so many living beings? His eyes widened slightly. Sonny threw his hand to the side to summon the midnight shard, and just in time, what happened next caused him to shudder. The creature moved once again, and then two dark flames appeared in its darkness. A moment later, a human figure stepped out of the shadow. It was a young man with pale skin and cold, cruel eyes of an experienced killer. A spark of madness burned in their depths. The stranger had black hair and was wearing a light armor made out of soft silk and black, lusterless leather. In his hands, the apparition was holding a long, slightly curved blade of an austere takai. Sonny felt fear grip his heart as he recognized the face in front of him. Of course, he did. It was his own face, after all. Looking at the devil of reckoning was like looking into a mirror. Sonny stammered, asking since when he was so scary. Sonny recoiled in shock and demanded to know what the hell the creature was. The apparition mimicked his expression, then opened its mouth. Its lips moved, however. There was no sound, as though the abomination was mute. Sonny had no problem reading its lips, though. The apparition mouthed the same question back at him, asking what the hell he was. Sonny muttered, wondering what was going on. Before he could finish that thought, though, he had to defend himself against a lightning-fast strike of the enemy's sword. Sonny deflected the fearsome attack and staggered back, his hands trembling from the force of the impact, and cursed sharply. The bastard might have looked like Sonny, but it was much, much stronger. About as strong as a fallen devil would probably be. Sonny had no time to recover before his evil twin was upon him once again, attacking with the painfully familiar grace of his own battle style. This time, the tip of the takai missed Sonny's eyes only by a few centimeters. A vicious smile appeared on the apparition's face. Sonny grunted. As the abomination launched a flurry of lethal attacks his way, each swift and vicious, he struggled to defend himself and fought through the pain. He was barely holding on, for now at least. Because of how strong and fast the creature was, Sonny had no doubt that he would be killed eventually. How could he fight against someone who knew all his tricks, but was also much more powerful? Even the shadow dance was useless. What was the point in trying to mirror the style of an opponent who had stolen his technique from Sonny himself? Situation did not look good at all, especially because blood was still streaming down Sonny's torso. Between two strikes, he dashed back and pierced the apparition with a furious gaze. Sonny snarled at the poor bastard, saying that of all the faces out there, it just had to choose his. He called it a fool, and asked whether it couldn't have chosen someone he didn't know taller. Internally, though, he couldn't help but think that he wasn't going to lie. The evil version of him looked sort of awesome. Was he really this dashing in real life? Sonny didn't really know how to feel about this. He wasn't, of course, trying to speak to the creature because he wanted to chat. He was just trying to distract it while Saint was drawing her bow. A moment later, a black arrow whistled in the air, aimed at the devil's heart. However, the young man with cruel dark eyes simply stepped to the side and swiped the arrow away with his sword. Sonny cursed. He became really despondent, though only a moment later, when a sudden ripple spread through the bizarre creature's body. In a blink of an eye, the apparition changed. Its face suddenly became white as alabaster and inhumanly beautiful, with ruby eyes, high cheekbones, and full lips. The soft fabric of its armor turned black as onyx and hard as stone. The shape and height of its body changed too. Before Sonny could even react, he wasn't facing his own reflection anymore. Instead, he was facing Saint's. Sonny muttered, "Crap." As the sickening feeling of his soul slowly falling apart permeated Sonny's entire being, the perfect copy of the taciturn demon raised its bow and sent an arrow flying straight at his heart. Sonny muttered that at least one mystery was solved. Sonny became painfully aware of how the devil of the reckoning was able to slaughter so many awakened, and why no nightmare creature could survive on its island. If the bastard was able to turn into a copy of any enemy while remaining as powerful as a fallen devil, then very few things could ever hope to escape from it alive. and those awakened who had escaped despite everything mistakenly believed that their companions fell to a creature that could mess with people's sight. What else would they think after watching a human being killed by what looked like their exact copy? Well, why had no one thought that it was an actual copy and not a trick on the eye, damn it? If there was one thing that landed Sonny in this dire situation, it was that people in the sanctuary severely lacked imagination. All these thoughts flashed through his mind as he used Shadow Step to disappear and fall awkwardly to the ground a dozen meters behind the devil, completely out of the way of the flying arrow. Sonny muttered, "Great, but now what?" Just a few moments before, Sonny had been contemplating abandoning the fight and simply running away. Unlike some humans he had met in the past, he wasn't burdened by useless things like pride or vanity. If the situation called for a cowardly escape, he was ready and willing to do just that. But now that the bastard had turned into saint and was holding a bow, the idea of trying to run was not very enticing. The last thing he wanted was to be hit in the back of his head by an arrow. Sonny urged himself to think. There was no time to think, though. The reflection of Saint swiftly spun and lunged toward him. As Sonny teleported further away, the creature suddenly pivoted and crashed into the trunk of a tall, ancient tree. A moment later, Sonny emerged from the shadows and saw with horror a giant mass of heavy wood plummeting on him from above. Desperately burning through his essence, he filled his body with as much strength as possible and raised his hands, trying to catch the falling tree. As a groan escaped from his mouth, Sonny's feet dug into the soft soil of the Reckoning Island. Somehow, he managed to stop the tree without being crushed by it. It was at this moment that a second arrow flashed toward his heart, only to collide with another one in the air and fly aside. Some distance away, the real saint dismissed the bow, raised her sword, and dashed toward the imposter. Sonny barked at the bastard to eat that. Sonny gritted his teeth, strained his already overtaxed muscles, and threw the massive tree at the abomination with a tremendously powerful push. When he used his essence and augmented his body with both shadows, Sonny was able to achieve bursts of truly inhuman strength. How was the bastard going to escape this? The creature indifferently lowered its shoulder, then simply disappeared into the shadows and appeared on the other side of the flying trunk. Then it met attacking Saint with a devastating shoulder bash. The onyx armor of the taciturn demon cracked, and she was thrown back, causing another tree to explode into a cloud of splinters. Sonny paled and stammered that Shadow Step was not good. The apparition turned to him and mockingly tilted its head. Something was very wrong with that thing. It seemed maleficent and utterly mad, but at the same time, incomplete somehow. Behind the evil will and terrifying killing intent that dwelled in its ruby eyes, there was a hint of some other, boundless emotion. Sonny faintly recognized the feeling of it, since he had felt the same deep and indescribable emotion one time before. Far below the hollow mountains, in the darkness of the misty stone labyrinth between two otherworldly rivers, he had sensed the same feeling of loss, anguish, and confusion in the shadows left behind by the companions of the first lord of the bright castle. He wondered to himself what even that thing was. He had no time to ponder about its nature, though, because the creature had once again turned into a pale young man with dark eyes and was lunging at him, a vicious smile frozen on its lips. Feeling a cold shiver running down his spine, Sonny realized that he would not win this fight, nor was he capable of escaping from the reckoning alive. This time, he was truly in danger. He was really going to die on this beautiful, peaceful island, and the last thing he was going to see before falling into the embrace of death would be his own reflection staring back at him through the eyes of his killer. Unless, Sonny sent Saint back into the soul sea and met the apparition's attack with a block, feeling his body shudder from the force of the blow. He had assumed that the devil of reckoning was a shadow, and it was indeed similar to one, but really, it was not. It only appeared as a shadow because Sonny himself had been in the form of a shadow when they first clashed. And once he had turned into a human, the devil, too, became a human. The young man with the cold eyes of a killer took a small step and made a high thrust with the tack. Sonny, however, knew his one fighting style too well to be caught by that trap. Knowing that the thrust was just a feint, he threw his own blade downward and just barely managed to deflect a vicious slash that followed. He was late by a fraction of a second, though. Another tear appeared in the fabric of the puppeteer's shroud, and a shallow wound on his thigh began seeping with blood. The creature was more of a reflection than a shadow. It mirrored everything about its enemy. Their appearance, their weapons, their battle technique, even their powers otherwise. How would it be able to use Shadow Step? In a sense, it was a perfect adversary. But that wasn't all. Sunny grimaced as the apparition threw his sword away and delivered a powerful kick that almost turned all of his ribs into bone dust. If not for the burst of essence he had sent to his legs, Sunny would have never managed to dodge that devastating blow. But his essence was already running dry, and his enemy seemed to be even stronger now, as though the more Sunny bled, the more powerful the pale young man became. The devil was even able to mirror the memories its enemy wielded. Before, Sunny had experienced the sole attack of the copy of the Broken Oath, and now the creature was obviously being fed raw power by the Blood Blossom. He attacked with the Midnight Shard to buy himself a couple of moments to think. The apparition had not seemed to be affected by the Broken Oath, though. Was that because it had assumed the form of Saint, who was immune to soul attacks? Did this mean that the devil was able to copy not only powers and memories, but attributes too? The creature easily deflected Sunny's attack and leaned forward to deliver the final blow. Sunny's only hope to escape it was to jump back. But what else did the creature copy? Was it really a perfect reflection? There was only one way to find out. Instead of jumping back, Sunny stepped forward and collided against the apparition, completely open, unable to escape being struck down by the enemy's blade. Before the deadly strike came, however, he leaned close to the devil's ear and whispered, so softly that no one except for the two of them would ever be able to hear what he had said. He whispered, "Stop," lost from light. And then the devil froze as though suddenly turned to stone. Sunny smiled. It was a perfect reflection, indeed. The apparition stood motionlessly, frozen in place by Sunny's quiet command. He could see his face reflecting in its dark eyes, even paler than usual, beads of sweat glistening in the sun. The creature was completely still, all its terrifying strength shackled by the four simple words Sunny had whispered to it. It was enslaved. No matter how powerful the strange abomination was, no amount of power could ever allow it to disobey the command of its new master, Sunny. By stealing his face and his powers, the creature had also inherited his innate ability, Shadow Bond. Sunny had made use of that bond to subjugate the devil, and now it was at his mercy. For now, at least. With a pained grimace, Sunny fell to the ground and drew in a hoarse breath, muttering that had been close. The wound on his thigh was not too serious, but the cut he had received as a shadow was long and deep. Blood weave had prevented him from losing too much blood and was going to ensure a fast recovery, but it had its limits. The wounds needed to be tended to. However, they could wait. Right now, Sunny had to decide what to do with the former ruler of Reckoning. The dreadful creature that had slain plenty of humans, and only gods knew how many nightmare creatures, which was now under his full control. Such a powerful abomination. It would surely be very helpful to have something that fearsome serving him, unable to disobey any command. He glanced at the frozen creature and shivered. Looking at it was still like looking in a mirror after all. Despite knowing that the thing in front of him was a nightmare creature, he couldn't help but see a slight young man with pale skin and dark eyes. Couldn't help but see himself. Yes, having a fallen devil do his bidding would be extremely beneficial. Especially because the apparition looked exactly like him. With a bit of cunning and preparation, Sunny would be able to seemingly appear in two places at the same time. If he ever needed to prove that he wasn't mongrel or accomplish something shady without drawing any suspicion, that would be a perfect way to do so. There were countless scenarios where such an ability would be incredibly useful. But there lay the problem. The creature was only enslaved because it had assumed his form. Since the creature could take any shape, it was going to stop possessing his aspect abilities, including Shadow Bond, as soon as it turned into something else. Then, it would be free of its shackles and able to do whatever it wanted, including unleashing its wrath on Sunny. That was why he had dismissed Saint before attempting to subjugate the apparition. He needed it to remain as his own reflection and no one else's. Yes. He could circumvent the possibility of losing control over the terrifying creature with a long series of complex orders that would limit when and how it could use its shape-shifting. But coming up with a foolproof net of prohibitions was a Herculean task. Sonny wasn't even sure that it was possible. He had spent a long time thinking of ways to escape this exact fate, so he knew better than most. Better than anyone, perhaps. How hard it was to keep an unwilling slave under control. Especially if the enslaved being was more powerful than its master. There would always be a way to twist words, find a loophole, and turn the orders given by the master against themselves. Sonny was sure of it. He had to be. So, what was he supposed to do with the frozen abomination? Standing up with a grimace, Sonny faced his perfect copy and looked at it with regret. The main reason for what he was about to do, nevertheless, was way less complicated. He simply didn't want to be a slaver. He didn't want to own any living thing. Sonny lingered for a while and then said,
"Don't be scared, I won't make you a slave. That would be too cruel of a fate, don't you think? Even for a nightmare creature like you."
With that, he raised his hand, as though to caress the cheek of the pale young man, and then swiped it swiftly across his neck. Almost invisible in the bright light, the ghostly blade of the moonlight shard trembled as drops of crimson blood fell from it into the vibrant grass. The young man didn't move, but his pupils widened. A few moments later, blood flowed from between his lips, painting his pale skin red. Sonny looked at the dying apparition, deeply disturbed by the visage in front of him, and stammered that was. Paled slightly but did not look away. In front of him, a person who looked exactly like himself was slowly drowning in blood, a crimson torrent flowing from his cut throat. A few moments later, when the creature was on death's doorstep, its body suddenly trembled and then shifted slightly. A tortured smile appeared on its face. The apparition's lips moved, but just as before, no sound escaped from them. However, Sonny thought that he had managed to read a few words. "We, never." Searching, that was what the apparition had tried to say. Then the light in its eyes extinguished. A strange ripple spread over the young man's body, and a moment later, thin cracks appeared on his skin. After a second or two, the creature shattered into a rain of silver glass, which then turned into a stream of light and disappeared. Only one jagged mirror shard remained laying in the grass, reflecting nothing but cold darkness. As Sonny stared at all this in bewilderment, the spell whispered,
"You have slain an ascended reflection mirror beast."
Sonny blinked and asked what it had just said. The spell, however, wasn't done speaking.
"You have received a memory."
Sonny stared at the ground, confused, and asked what had just happened. Why did the spell call that thing an ascended reflection? What was a reflection? And why was it ascended instead of fallen? How could a nightmare creature be ascended? He frowned. Was it not a nightmare creature? How is that possible? The apparition was definitely not a human. So what else could it be if not one of the dream realm's abominations? And one more thing. The spell did not say that his shadow had grown stronger, did it? To make sure, Sonny checked the number of his shadow fragments. Just as he had suspected, it didn't change. He even dove into the soul sea and saw that there was no new shadow among the rows of the creatures he had slain, muttering that this was very, very strange. What the hell had he just killed? With a deep frown on his face, Sonny bent down and cautiously picked up the jagged mirror shard that the apparition had left behind. No matter how he looked at it, the shard resembled a perfectly mundane piece of glass, with a thin layer of silver painted over its reverse side. The only strange thing about it was that no matter how Sonny turned the shard, it refused to reflect anything except for an impenetrable veil of darkness. There was also an inscription on its reverse. Sonny's frown deepened when he realized that the inscription was not made with runes. Instead, what he saw were the familiar letters of the human alphabet. They were clumsy and awkward, as though written by a child's hand. There was only one word written on the mirror shard, and Sonny read it aloud. Beastie. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The mystery of the mirror beast was so strange that, for a time, Sonny even forgot about the burning pain in his side. Eventually, he whispered the word echo half to himself. Echoes did not possess souls, so he expected that slaying one would not reward him with any shadow fragments, just like what had happened after Mirror Beast's death. The apparition, however, was obviously not an echo. It was too independent sentient and had too much individuality to be a simple copy of a dead nightmare creature, not to mention that it had been ruling the reckoning for the past few years, with no human master in sight. There was, however, a type of being that it resembled. Sunny threw a dark look at the remains of a tree that had been shattered by Saint's body. In many ways, the strange reflection resembled a shadow. Was the Mirror Beast a type of echo created by someone's aspect? Its creator must have been incredibly powerful then. If so, where were they? What had happened to them? And why was their reflection wandering the chained aisles in a feral state? There were no answers. It was just a theory anyway. Sunny had no proof whatsoever to substantiate it. Maybe his new memory would give him some answers. He was about to summon the runes, but a sudden pulse of pain reminded him that he was, in fact, still wounded. With a hiss, Sunny clutched at his side and looked around, searching for shelter. He was going to have to tend to his wounds and rest after the fight with Mirror Beast. The memory could wait until after he wasn't bleeding so much. Wrapping the strange mirror shard in a piece of fabric and placing it into his pack, Sunny used some of his last remaining reserve of shadow essence to step through the shadows and appear near the rocky hill in the center of the island. His shadow had noticed a shallow cave there, which was situated, obviously, behind the foaming wall of the picturesque waterfall. Walking on a narrow stone ledge that led behind the waterfall, Sunny checked that the cave was empty and then entered its cool shade. The cave wasn't very big, but due to its location and hidden nature, there was no better shelter on the entire island. Rather happy with this discovery, Sunny groaned and lowered himself to the ground. Sending Saint to keep watch outside, he dismissed the puppeteer's shroud, then opened his pack and took out a small box containing several thin needles and a span of silk thread. Staring at the needles with a deadpan expression, Sunny sighed and muttered that he hated this part. Due to his awakened body and the nature of blood weave, Sunny could recover from most injuries much faster than any mundane human or even one of his peers would be able to. However, if he wanted to be able to travel again by tomorrow, he still had to take measures. With another sigh, he threaded one of the needles, gritted his teeth, and began suturing the edges of the long cut on his side together. The process was not very pleasant, to say the least. So the cave was full of the sounds of heavy breathing and suppressed curses for a while. Finally, Sunny was done. Washing the dried blood off his body with the help of the endless spring, he grimaced and looked around. Now that he had time to take a better look at the cave, he noticed that it had apparently been used as shelter by another human at some point in the past. There was a circle of stones built to contain a fire with a bunch of firewood arranged neatly by its side. By now, the wood had long rotted, letting Sunny know that the cave remained empty for many years. There was a pack much like his own laying on the cold stones near the fire pit. He limped toward it and took a look inside. There was nothing of particular interest there, just the usual supplies a traveling awakened would take with them on a long expedition, most of them ruined by the humidity inside the cave and the passage of time. He did, however, retrieve a rolled-up map and studied it for some time. The map had been drawn on a piece of monster hide, so the humid air did it no favors. Most of it was unreadable, with only a few small pieces remaining intact. Sunny judged that the person who had left it behind was much more knowledgeable about the chained aisles than he was. Sadly, none of that knowledge had been preserved. The only legible word he could easily read was written near the edge of the tier. It read, and Sunny read the word aloud. Hope. Sunny sighed. The stranger whose map he was studying had most likely been killed by the Mirror Beast. For a moment, he entertained the idea that the map had actually been left behind by the creator of the strange reflection, but that theory made little sense. Why would such a powerful person leave not only his things, but also his creation behind? Putting the map back into the rotted pack, Sunny glanced at the fire pit and said after a long pause,
I'm sorry that your hopes had been for naught. Whoever you were, now your nightmare is over.
With that, he hesitated for a few moments, and then finally summoned the runes. It was time to take a look at the memory he had received for slaying the terrifying creature that the spell had called the Mirror Beast. A few seconds later, Sunny's eyes widened, and he breathed that it was a weapon. Sunny stared at the shimmering runes, excitement rising in his heart. This was what he had been waiting for.
Memory Cruel Sight, Memory Rank Ascended, Memory Tier 4, Memory Type Weapon.
The weapon.
Sunny had been searching for a new weapon for a long time. He was very fond of the Midnight Shard, since that was the sword he had carried through the darkest time of his life, and with which he had fought his way out of the hell of the Forgotten Shore. It was a very powerful memory, too, one whose enchantment had saved his life on several occasions. However, Sunny felt that he had outgrown the austere Takai, or rather, the obstacles he was facing these days had. Many of the nightmare creatures on the chained isles were of the fallen rank, and their tough hides presented a lot of resistance to the sharp blade of the awakened sword, not to mention those corrupted horrors that Sunny avoided to the best of his ability for now, but was inevitably bound to encounter one day. The other reason he wanted to procure a new weapon was the fact that the unbroken enchantment, while extremely potent and useful, could only be accessed in very rare circumstances. Namely, when Sunny was nearing death, this meant that the most powerful trait of the Midnight Shard could only help Sunny if he made a terrible mistake. If Sunny fought with skill and foresight, however, thus keeping himself from being mortally wounded, the powerful enchantment remained inactive as it had for the past months. Paradoxically, the better Sunny performed, the less useful the Midnight Shard was to him. It was nice to have a last resort. But Sunny did not like the idea of relying on a tool that could only be effective if he failed. He wanted to possess a weapon whose enchantments were reliant on his success, and as such, both strengthened him and rewarded him for doing well. Hopefully, this was one such weapon. It was an ascended memory of the 4th tier, equivalent to a memory he would have received from a fallen devil. That was already a tremendous start. His most powerful weapon right now, the Moonlight Shard, had come from a mere fallen beast. Trying to control his expectations, Sunny trembled in anticipation and read further.
Memory Description. Full of pride, the noble knight made a deal with the dream spawn. Years later, the knight had defeated all his enemies and became a mighty king. On the day that his son uttered the first word, the dream spawn came to the king and demanded his pay. He left the kingdom with the child and disappeared, never to be seen again. Much later, the young prince returned and stood beneath his father's throne. He expected to be met with joy and warmth, but was met with fear and suspicion instead.
Sunny frowned and muttered, wondering what the hell that was supposed to mean. The description mentioned a dream spawn, or rather the dream spawn. That was the name of an attribute Nephis had, which she possessed because of being born from a hollow mother. Were there other people with the same attribute among the human race? There had to be. And judging by this strange tale, they had been feared even here in the dream realm. No, that didn't make any sense. Nephis was described as being born of 2 worlds, so how could a native of the dream realm possess the same attribute?
Very strange. Maybe the name is just a coincidence.
Sunny shrugged, then concentrated on the runes and murmured for them to tell him what they could do.
Memory Enchantments. Shapeshifter, Light Eater, Ghost Blade, Dark Mirror.
His eyes gleamed, and he exclaimed that there were 4 of them.
Shapeshifter Enchantment Description. This weapon can shift form between a sword and a spear.
Sunny hesitated for a moment, then turned away from the runes and summoned the Cruel Sight. He just had to see this. A tenebrous mist shrouded his hand, and then an elegant sword appeared in it. It was much shorter than the Midnight Shard, with a leaf-shaped blade that was about as long as the distance between Sunny's elbow and the tip of his middle finger. The blade seemed to be forged out of polished silver and served as a perfectly clear mirror. Looking into it, Sunny could see the reflection of his pale face and the wall of the cave behind him. The hilt of the short sword was made out of polished black wood, which was encased in intricately engraved silver near the guard and at the pommel. The cruel sight was light and swift. Sunny slashed the air several times and smiled. It was going to take some time to get used to using a single-handed sword, but he liked it. It already felt like an extension of his hand. It was much more suited for stealth attacks, too. The sword was also double-edged, which gave him more freedom in how to use it. But that wasn't all. Following a mental command, the hilt of the sword suddenly began to extend. A second later, Sunny was holding a long, graceful spear. The black shaft contrasted against the silver blade, creating a beautiful and somber image. The blade itself kept its length, so Sunny could perform not only thrusting attacks but also cuts and slashes. He stared at the somber, elegant spear for a bit, then commanded it to turn back into the sword. This was going to be a challenge. Sunny wasn't really proficient with polearms, but he had seen how versatile, unpredictable, and deadly they could be in the hands of a master. Not to mention that he had wished to have more distance between himself and the nightmare creatures he fought on numerous occasions. This weapon was a perfect combination of mobility and reach, allowing him to effortlessly switch between a nimble short sword and a devastating long spear. It gave him access to the best of both worlds. His smile widened, and he breathed that this was perfect. What else could it do? There were 3 enchantments left.
Light Eater enchantment description. The blade of this weapon can reflect, absorb, and expel light.
That would be useful to control shadows, as well as potentially blinding the opponents.
Ghost Blade enchantment description. This weapon can strike at incorporeal targets.
An incredible ability that would give Sunny the ability to fight against some of the most dangerous creatures in the dream realm, those wraiths that were immune to physical damage.
Dark Mirror enchantment description. Each attack of this weapon can be augmented with elemental damage. It can be charged with any element the wielder has been damaged by. Current charge none.
Sunny gasped and exclaimed that a permanent elemental augmentation was incredible. Sunny stared at the emptiness for some time, thinking. His new weapon was an ascended one of the 4th rank, which already made it much more formidable than anything else in his arsenal. It was adamantine and sharp as a razor, which would allow him to cut through fallen creatures as though they were made of butter. Well, not exactly, but rather close. Added to that were the considerable reach of its spear form and the incredible swiftness of its sword form. But there was more. The cruel sight was capable of augmenting its attacks with elemental damage. That meant that each wound Sunny would deliver to his enemies would be more dire. Not only that, but the nature of the augmentation could be changed, which meant that if given enough time to prepare, he would be able to exploit the weaknesses of his opponents with the element they were most vulnerable to. He just had to get himself wounded by that same element. Sunny winced and muttered a quiet ouch. Everything that was worth it had to hurt a little. Sunny had learned it many years ago. Speaking of which, he sighed, then summoned the cruel sight and held it in his hands for a bit. Then he stood up and walked toward the exit from the cave. As the sound of the waterfall grew louder and louder, he prepared himself. A second later, Sunny entered the field of soul erosion emanated from Saint's armor. Instantly, he felt weak and in pain, as though the very essence of his self was being dissolved by a terrible force. Sunny groaned and spat a curse. No matter how many times he was subjected to the effect of the broken oath, it was a vile feeling every time. The only good thing about it was that souls, just like bodies, could heal with time, and as long as he did not spend too much time being damaged by the evil memory, he would be able to recover in a day or two. Gritting his teeth, Sunny summoned the runes describing the cruel sight and simultaneously sent essence into its silver blade, activating the dark mirror enchantment. As his contorted face reflected in the polished silver of the elegant sword, nothing about it changed. However, the cruel sight suddenly seemed different, as though an invisible, cold, and sharp aura surrounded its edges. Sunny looked at the description of the dark mirror.
Current charge soul.
With a relieved sigh, he took a few steps back and escaped the radius of the broken oath. The sensation of his soul being slowly destroyed swiftly disappeared. The runes, however, did not change. Sunny had to feed the memory with a small amount of shadow essence to activate the augmenting enchantment, but its blade would remain entwined with the element of his choice until he charged it with another. A cruel smile appeared on his lips, just like that. Sunny now possessed a weapon capable of dealing soul damage, the rarest and most insidious type of damage he knew of, one that very few beings out there had any resistance to. In a span of one day, his lethality had grown manyfold. Dismissing the somber sword, Sunny turned around and walked back into the cave.
I guess I am the true harbinger of reckoning now.
His gloomy shadow lingered for a bit, then scratched the back of its head. For once, it had nothing to add. 2 days later, Sunny was finally approaching Shipwreck Island. Currently, he was on the neighboring one, hiding in the shadow of a collapsed stone tower that had long ago become overgrown with moss. Somewhere behind him, the body of a giant worm-like creature lay on the ground, its body dripping with foul black blood. Sunny had spent a lot of essence jumping through shadows to avoid being devoured by that thing, no matter how many times he had pierced its flesh with his spear. The worm seemed to possess an almost endless amount of vitality. The fact that Sunny had no idea where any of the abomination's vital organs were only made the situation worse. In the end, however, the nightmare creature had succumbed to the damage being continuously dealt to its soul. And now, it was dead. Swarms of smaller, but no less repulsive worms were already emerging from the ground to feast on its flesh. Sunny did not care. He had already retrieved the soul shard from the creature's body, and he surely had no plans of using the worm's meat as food. And regardless, his attention was currently concentrated elsewhere. Sunny muttered, asking what the hell that was. The Shipwreck Island was currently at the height of its ascent phase and loomed high above in the sky. As the result, Sunny was able to see its underbelly far away in the distance. The downside of the island was shrouded in eternal shadow, and something vast and terrifying was moving in it. The inhabitants of the dark side were all powerful and unsightly, but the thing nesting under that one, in particular, was especially harrowing. Perhaps all islands this close to the tier sheltered such horrors. But even that was not the thing Sunny was looking at. He murmured that he guessed he had his answer. A long time ago, one of the chains connected to Shipwreck Island had broken and now hung down. Entangled in it, a giant iron corpse swayed slowly in the wind. The creature resembled a man made entirely out of metal. The heavenly chain had coiled around one of his legs, so the giant hung with his head down, his face rusted and severely damaged. His powerful chest was caved in and shattered by some titanic blow, and one of his arms was torn away at the shoulder. This was, without a doubt, the creature whose lost limb gave the name to the Iron Hand Island. The dead giant swayed despondently in the wind, producing sounds of rusty metal scraping against the iron of the heavenly chain. Those sounds were loud enough to reach across the gap between two islands and be heard by Sunny in his hiding place. Looking at that humbling sight, Sunny shivered and asked who could have killed such a thing. Of course, there was no way to know. Just like always, finding one answer had immediately presented Sunny with a dozen new questions. Nervously shifting his gaze between the hanged giant and the swarm of worms ravenously devouring their elder, Sunny remained hidden in the shadows and waited. Soon, the rattling of chains announced that the Shipwreck Island was starting to descend. Sunny tensed and breathed that it was time. The chain leading to the Shipwreck Island was about 4 kilometers long, which was on the shorter side by the chained isle standards. As a swift shadow, Sunny would have been able to ride it all the way to his destination in just a few minutes. Sadly, the heavenly chain was currently drawn taut and nowhere near the sky below, which meant that its links weren't covered by a thick layer of shadows. He was going to have to cross it on foot, as the ground behind him started to move, announcing the approach of something far more hungry and terrifying than the swarm of gluttonous maggots. Sunny slid out of his hiding spot, dashed toward the edge of the island, and jumped down. Falling through the vast expanse of the blue sky, he landed on the iron surface of the heavenly chain, rolled down a few meters, and then finally caught his balance. The chain stretched far into the distance, rising higher and higher until it connected with the slowly descending Shipwreck Island. Unlike how it was with the other pieces of land Sunny had seen in this strange region of the dream realm, the chain didn't simply disappear into the soil, but instead led to a tall stone structure that resembled a castle gate. Two massive pillars rose high into the sky, overgrown by vines and moss. The gate itself had been broken a long time ago, and now the space between the pillars was empty, the wind passing freely through its vast opening. Further away, the corpse of the iron giant continued to sway in the air, his one remaining hand pointed at the sky below. Summoning the cruel sight, Sunny turned it into the spear and cautiously moved forward. The further he walked, the lower the shipwreck island descended, until finally the heavenly chain became almost horizontal. In about an hour, Sunny crossed the abyss separating two isles and approached the stone structure he had noticed from afar. Up close, it was even more monumental. He found out that he had been wrong, though. The pillars did not seem like they had ever served to house a massive gate. Instead, they just reached for the sky, built for some unknown purpose. There were weathered steps cut into each of the pillars, leading all the way to the top. Sunny frowned and muttered, wondering who would be crazy enough to climb that high. Even now that the island had descended, up there on top of the monumental pillars, the crushing must have been suffocating. With a shrug, he used the dark wing to glide upward and climbed onto a wide stone platform between the pillars. From here, the remains of an ancient road led further into the island. Following it to reach the top of a low hill, Sunny stopped and looked down at the site of the peculiar landmark that gave this place its name. At the very heart of the desolate island, a large wooden ship lay broken on the ground. It must have been beautiful and magnificent once, but now, all that remained of its former glory were the fluid lines of the graceful and narrow hull. The ancient wood somehow remained untouched by the passage of time, but the bow of the ship was completely shattered. There were also large breaches here and there along the length of the wreck and green vines covering large sections of it. What was a ship doing at the heart of a land that had no rivers and no seas remained a mystery. But Sunny became hypnotized by the sight of a crushed vessel for a completely different reason. A triumphant spark appeared in his eyes, and he exclaimed that he guessed he was in luck today. With a dark smile, he shifted his gaze and looked at the tall mast of the ship. A dead, withered tree coiled around it, its naked branches stretching into the sky like bones. Sunny recognized that tree, even if it looked very different from how it was depicted on the reverse side of the mysterious coins. Full of life and in bloom, this was the same ship he had seen before, which meant that the coin might have come from inside the wreck, or at least was connected to it somehow. Initially, Sunny had only planned to scout the vicinity of the island and search for the traces left by the dead chain worm. But now, he felt as though this scouting expedition could actually lead him directly to the treasure he so desperately wanted to find. What were the chances that the coins depicting the strange ship came from somewhere else? Close to zero, most likely. Now, he only had to sneak into the wreck, explore it, and return in one piece, which was not an easy task, considering how close to the tier the island was. Sunny could not see any nightmare creatures moving across its surface, but he knew that there had to be some, and that they were going to be of the truly dreadful kind. Still, he wasn't going to turn back now. Sunny muttered that it was worth it. Sunny spent some time observing the island. No matter how hard he looked and how much his shadows roamed around, he couldn't see any abominations anywhere near the ancient ship. That didn't mean there were none, though. It just meant that they were better at hiding than he was at looking. After a while, Sunny frowned and summoned Saint. The taciturn demon stepped out of his shadow a few hundred meters down the slope of the hill and indifferently looked around. Then she dismissed her bow, and instead summoned a melee weapon. The midnight shard appeared in her hands, its austere blade reflecting the black onyx of the shadow's armor. The two suited each other very well. Saint turned her back to Sunny, raised the long takai, and calmly headed toward the distant wreck. After 30 seconds or so, he left his shelter and followed, keeping to the shadows. Minute after minute passed in tense silence. Despite his expectations, they didn't meet any powerful abominations. The island was quiet and deserted, covered only by overgrown ruins, vines, and piles of broken wood. When they were halfway to the ship, however, something finally changed. As Saint approached one of the piles of debris, it suddenly moved. and then assembled itself into the shape of a tall, menacing humanoid creature, its hands ending in long, jagged blades. As countless similar piles of splintered wood began to move all around them, Sunny breathed out a curse and spat damnation. Before the first wood wraith could even fully form, Saint was already upon it. The blade of the midnight shard flashed through the air and bit into the body of the creature with the dull sound of an axe striking the bark of a tree. The effect was somewhat the same. Although she managed to do some damage, the wraith simply ignored the shallow cut and lurched forward, towering above the graceful stone knight with destructive menace. Its hands fell down with crushing force, the wooden blades aimed at Saint's helmet. Wood couldn't cut stone, right? The shadow seemed reluctant to check. She easily sidestepped the creature's attack and thrust upward, driving the tip of the midnight shard into the enemy's neck. Augmented by one of Sunny's shadows, the sword went deep into the adamantine wood. A moment later, the second shadow wrapped itself around the body of the taciturn demon, causing her skin to shine with dark radiance. The coral gem of the broken oath glowed brightly on her black breastplate. Saint twisted her blade and pushed it sideways, causing half of the wood wraith's neck to explode into a rain of splinters. The creature staggered and lashed out with another strike, but it was too late. The shadow calmly shifted her weight from one leg to another and delivered a devastating slash, beheading her enemy. As the wraith fell apart and turned back into a pile of debris, she looked at it indifferently and then hit the dull side of the midnight shard's blade against her shoulder twice. The voice of the spell whispered,
You have slain a fallen beast, sailor doll, your shadow grows stronger.
Sunny gritted his teeth and cursed crap. Augmented by two shadows, Saint had defeated one of these dolls without too much problem. However, there were countless more rising from the ground. Sunny counted at least several dozen before losing count and asked what he should do. Fighting the horde of fallen beasts was clearly suicide. He could either retreat or order Saint to draw their attention away and sneak onto the ship. He could also recall one of the shadows, send it ahead, and then use Shadow Step to travel instantly between his current position and the wreck. But that meant leaving Saint weaker. Decisions.
She should be fine for a few minutes, right?
Throwing a glance at the taciturn demon, Sunny sighed and dashed toward the ship, calling out for them to have fun. Saint looked at him, then silently turned away and raised the midnight shard. As Sunny jumped from shadow to shadow, something crashed thunderously behind him.
You have slain a fallen beast.
But not too much fun.
No matter how formidable his demon was when augmented by the shadow and wielding a powerful memory, she was still just an awakened. He had to be swift. As Sunny appeared from a shadow, something massive suddenly lunged at him. Without slowing down, he dove under the blade of another wood wraith, then lashed out with the cruel sight. The silver blade of the sword cut through the body of the abomination, leaving a deep gash on its side. Sunny slid on the moss, escaping from the attack reach of the massive creature. Twisting around, he thrust his sword into empty air. A split second later, however, the hilt of the somber weapon extended, turning it into a long spear. The silver blade pierced the chest of the wood wraith with surprising ease. The sailor doll was still alive, but its soul was damaged. It staggered and took a step forward, driving the spear deeper into its flesh. Sunny tilted his head, then dissolved into shadows and appeared behind the creature. A moment later, the moonlight shard pierced its head.
You have slain a fallen beast, sailor doll, your shadow grows stronger.
Sunny retrieved his weapons.
You have slain.
Saint was busy too, glancing back. He saw that she was close to being surrounded by a mass of menacing wooden creatures. Sunny muttered that this was not good. Not wasting any more time, Sunny turned away and continued moving toward the wreck. A few minutes later, Sunny reached the broken ship, dove into one of the breaches in its hull and hid in the shadows. Then he immediately dismissed Saint, making sure that nothing posed an immediate threat to him. He then quickly checked on the taciturn demon in the Soul Sea. The shadow had received several wounds in the fight against the swarm of wraiths, but none of them was too serious. She was going to have to spend some time restoring herself in the nurturing black flames of the shadow core still. Sunny murmured for Saint to rest well, that she deserved it. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then retrieved the memories he had entrusted to her. Who knew what he was going to encounter inside the ancient ship? It was better to be safe than sorry. Looking around, he studied the interior of a small room he had found himself in. Sunny had no knowledge whatsoever of what the insides of a ship were supposed to look like, let alone of an archaic wooden vessel like this one. That was why he couldn't even guess what purpose this cabin had been intended for. All he saw were piles of debris, absolutely mundane for a change, and thick brown vines covering the walls. The air was stale and murky. It smelled a little sweet. Sunny groaned, "Oh crap, here we go again." With a subtle shudder, Sunny stared at the strange reddish-brown vines. Those things, without a doubt, were alive. They were also the source of the sweet smell permeating the air that Sunny was currently breathing. What was even worse, they were obviously just a small part of some much larger organism. As a strange feeling appeared in his lungs, Sunny sighed, took a piece of cloth from his pack, and wrapped it tightly around the lower part of his face.
Bloodweave to the rescue, let's see what's inside.
He only took a few steps when something gleamed on the floor in front of him. Bending down, Sunny picked up the small object and stared at it with a complicated expression. A heavy golden coin rested in his palm. Grasping the coin in his fist, Sunny took a step forward, then cautiously walked around a thick vine sprawled across the floor of the small cabin. Or was it a wall? Since the ancient ship was laying on its side and at an angle, it was hard to differentiate the floor from the ceiling. The surface beneath Sunny's feet was skewed, forcing him to bend to be able to keep balance. The piles of debris and the vines weren't making things any easier for him. By now, Sunny was almost sure that the vines were a part of a larger creature. His suspicion only grew when he climbed through the narrow doorway and left the cabin, finding himself in a wide corridor. Sunny felt that the sweet smell permeating the murky air became much stronger. Here, everything was covered by a thick layer of reddish moss, with twisted vines growing through it as they stretched in every direction. Sunny couldn't help but feel as though he was now inside some giant being, with the wooden carcass of the ancient ship serving as its bones, the moss representing its flesh and the vines being its veins. The warm breeze that blew through the wreck at rhythmic intervals reminded him of slow breathing of a slumbering giant. It came from somewhere deeper in the ship, bringing with it the sickeningly sweet smell, and then disappeared for a dozen seconds, only to appear again.
Let's not do anything to awaken that thing then.
Sunny thought for a few moments, and then decided to keep both shadows wrapped around his body instead of sending them to explore the ship. In situations where a confrontation with an unknown enemy could happen at any moment, having them close by was of paramount importance. At least that approach had saved his life many times in the past. Taking a step forward, he felt the moss spring under his foot and then swayed. His vision blurred slightly. Sunny groaned in pain. His worst expectations did not come true. Unlike the blood blossom, the tiny grains of pollen, or spores, or whatever it was that he had breathed in, had not tried to take root in his lungs and grow through his flesh. Instead, they simply poisoned him. The poison had entered his lungs, then traveled to his bloodstream, and was now spreading through his body. Sunny could easily see himself losing consciousness and falling to the ground, his body then becoming overgrown by the reddish moss. Slowly digested by it, turned into nourishment for the creature that had usurped the wreck of the ancient ship. But he wasn't going to. As soon as the poison entered his bloodstream, Bloodweave went into a frenzy. It seemed to really dislike anything alien invading its territory. Slowly but surely, it went about destroying the toxin. Sunny just had to endure the pain. Summoning the cruel sight, he used the shaft of the spear to help himself keep balance and waited for his vision to become clear again. After a minute or two, Sunny slowly exhaled and continued on his way. A few minutes later, still suffering from pain and weakness, he picked up a second coin from the moss and stared at it for a second. The beautiful person with a crescent moon drawn on their forehead smiled at him with a carefree expression. Sunny frowned in response and muttered, asking what the fool was so happy about. Turning away, he noticed another coin gleaming in the moss a couple of meters further down the corridor. It was almost as though someone left these coins here like breadcrumbs to lead an unsuspecting treasure hunter to their prize. Very convenient. Full of unease, Sonny walked over to the third coin, picked it up, hid it in his pack, and then cautiously moved deeper into the wreck. Soon, he approached a wall with a massive gate barring it. The wooden surface of the wall had cracked and was bent outward, as though something was pressing heavily on it from the other side. The vines out here were especially thick and gnarled, shining in the beams of sunlight that fell through a wide hole in the hull of the ship right above. The sweet smell in the air was almost overwhelming. Sonny stared at the warped wall, a grim expression on his face. Although he could not see through it, he could feel the shapes of shadows on the other side. Hidden from him by the thick bulkhead was a much larger, vast, and open space. He judged it to be the main cargo hold of the ancient ship, and in it, something massive was moving, slowly expanding and contracting. Brown vines that had devoured the wreck all originated from that place. The sickening breeze that blew through the ancient ship from time to time came simultaneously with the contracting of the massive shadow. Sonny lingered for a while, then decided that he had no desire to disturb the slumber of that being. Instead of trying to open the door, he jumped up, grabbed the edges of the hole above him, and climbed onto the exterior of the ship's hull. He was reasonably sure that a treasure such as miraculous coins would not have been stored in the main hold with the rest of the mundane cargo, anyway. Unless he was absolutely certain that he had no other choice, he was not going to enter it. Sonny was of a rather high opinion about his abilities, but not so high as to forget all fear. That thing inside was not for him to fight, at least not yet. How was he supposed to kill a giant mass of vines and moss, anyway? Instead of trying, he walked on the sloping hull of the ancient ship, carefully avoiding breaches through which thick brown vines were crawling outside, and soon passed the area of the main cargo hold. Now, he was approaching the shattered bow of the ship. Out here, the hull was heavily damaged, with most of it being riddled with wide cracks, jagged holes, and splintered boards. The sight of it made Sonny wonder about what had happened to the graceful ship he had seen on the miraculous coins. The vessel was obviously not an ordinary one. Why had it crashed here on that remote island? Why was its bow in such a devastated condition? What had the ship sailed on to begin with? Had it just flown through the skies? If so, maybe the crushing had gotten to it. Feeling that he wouldn't be able to remain hidden in the shadows on this treacherous surface, Sonny crawled back inside and landed softly on the carpet of moss. Just a few steps from where he found himself, several golden coins were gleaming on the ground, with one more laying further down the dark corridor. Sonny cautiously gathered them, then moved deeper into the wreck. It wasn't long before he found the compartment that must have served as the ship's treasury. He knew that there was something special about it instantly, simply for the fact that the floorboards around the heavy door were the only place on the entire ancient ship that was completely free of the reddish moss, the gnarled vines, and the air near it was void of the sickeningly sweet smell of the poisonous spores. Standing in front of the door, Sonny smiled. Eureka! Sonny approached the heavily reinforced door and tried to sense if something was moving on the other side of it. There was nothing. It didn't feel as though something dangerous waited for him inside the treasury. On the contrary, with how fresh the air was and how clean the floorboards were, the treasury looked almost inviting. He wasn't entirely convinced, though. Sonny lingered for a bit, then commanded one of his shadows to separate itself from his body and slide under the door. It was going to remain very close, so he was willing to risk weakening himself for a bit. Sonny muttered, wondering how he was even supposed to open the thing. A moment later, Sonny grimaced and covered his face with a palm. When did I become this stupid? Looking through the eyes of the happy shadow, he saw the armored compartment in its entirety. It was a large room with a high ceiling and 3 heavy chests standing in its center. The entire back wall of the treasury, though, was missing, letting in a flood of sunlight through the jagged edges of a massive breach. Sonny snapped that of course it was missing. The chain worm had to have gotten inside somehow after all. Sonny doubted that the demon could have fit through the door of the treasury. let alone politely lock it behind itself after leaving. He sighed, then shook his head and decided to attribute this momentary lapse of judgment to the taxing nature of having to endure the pain of being poisoned. No one was there to witness him making a fool out of himself, anyway. Regardless, there was no terrifying nightmare creature laying in wait on the other side of the reinforced door. Nothing was going to attack him if he entered. Sonny considered climbing back on top of the hull of the ship and finding a way to enter through the breach in the back wall of the treasury, then simply stepped through the shadows and appeared inside. He was too excited and impatient to waste any more time. Not to mention that the more time he spent here, the more chances there were of something going terribly wrong. If there were really hundreds of coins in one of those chests, though, that would be a trophy to put all other trophies to shame, a find of a lifetime. Sonny waited for a couple of seconds, letting his eyes adapt to the bright light of the sun, and then studied the 3 chests standing in the middle of the armored compartment. All 3 were open. 2 stood empty, but the third. His eyes widened in shock. The third chest was long and adamantine, its dark wood reinforced by strips of dull metal. It was large enough to fit an adult man, and filled to the brim with heavy gold coins. Some spilled out of it and were laying on the floor in a tantalizing pile, showing either the beautiful face of the mysterious charmer or the reverse depicting the ancient ship. Sonny breathed that there were thousands of them. Sonny felt his heart skip a beat and swayed slightly. In front of him was a treasure that would take him all the way to forming a third core, and then some. With this many miraculous coins, Sonny would be able to annihilate the gap between himself and Nephis, maybe even overtake her. Sonny whispered that this couldn't be true. He instinctively wanted to think that it had been far too easy, but it wasn't really. He had almost died while fighting the mirror beast, allowed Saint to be injured in a fight against sailor dolls, walked through the poisonous darkness of the ancient wreck. If it wasn't for the blood weave, he would have been already dead. How many people out there could boast about carrying the legacy of a demon in their veins? For almost anyone else, this trip would have been fatal. Not to mention that very few could have made the series of discoveries and logical conclusions that would lead them here. So no, it wasn't too easy to get to where he was currently standing. It wasn't easy at all. And anyway, Sonny was due for a bit of good luck. Recently, nothing had really gone his way. Take this whole mongrel fiasco, for example. Or everything that had happened in the Crimson Spire. The heavy chest stood silently, surrounded by sunlight. The golden coins shined in the bright radiance, inviting him to come and take them. Sonny gulped. This sight was so beautiful. His eyes gleamed with avarice, and he murmured that he wouldn't mind if he did. Taking several steps forward, he approached the chest.
Gold is heavy. How am I going to carry all of this back to the sanctuary? Damnation. I won't be able to enter the shadows with all that burden too. That is a problem.
He reached for the coins, but then stopped suddenly. His hand hovered just outside the invitingly open chest. Something wasn't quite right. Sonny frowned.
What is it? Maybe I can bury the chest and make several trips. Wait, no, what's wrong here?
His frown deepened. There was no danger inside the treasury, nor was there anything moving outside of it. The terrifying creature that had been slumbering in the cargo hold of the ancient ship was still asleep. There were no sailor dolls wandering nearby too, so what was disturbing him? Sonny muttered about the chain worm. The chain worm had swallowed several coins. He also had a piece of the chest in its stomach, the wood splintered, the strips of metal torn. Sonny had even thought how lucky he was that the demon decided to feast on the metal reinforcing the chest and bit a chunk out of it, swallowing the coins in the process. So, if he had torn a piece from the chest, why wasn't the chest missing a piece? And what had mortally wounded the chain worm, anyway? Confused, Sonny glanced at the 2 empty chests. They were perfectly whole with no parts missing. Then he looked back at the large, heavy chest in front of him, his hand still hovering a few centimeters away from the pile of gold inside. The chest had all its corners too. One of them, though, was of a slightly different color, like a patch of new skin that had grown over a wound and didn't quite match all the rest. Since when were chests capable of healing? Sonny started to ask what the hell. Before Sonny could finish the thought, though the chest seemed to have sensed his hesitation. It suddenly lurched forward, and as massive jagged teeth suddenly appeared from beneath the gold, its heavy lid closed on Sonny's hand with a sickening sound of breaking bones. As golden coins moved, revealing several rows of terrifying triangular teeth, Sonny recoiled. But it was too late. The heavy lid of the chest suddenly came to life and closed with astonishing speed, another row of fangs appearing from behind its edge. Sonny gasped, stammering what? Just a fraction of a second before the creature sunk its teeth into his forearm, Sonny's other hand shot forward. The blade of the cruel sight slid between the falling guillotine of the chest's lid and the fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. A moment later, the chest closed, and Sonny screamed. Because of his quick reaction, the creature failed to bite his whole hand off. However, its jaws turned out to be horribly powerful. With a sickening sound, the bones in his arm shattered. Neither the leather vambrace of the puppeteer's shroud nor the augmentation of the shadow managed to resist the terrible strength of the gluttonous chest. Sonny found himself caught in the abomination's crushing maw, with the blade of the cruel sight laying flat on top of his broken arm and protecting it from being pierced by the sharp teeth that protruded from the lid of the chest. From below, several triangular fangs were slowly sinking into his vambrace. There was no obvious way to free himself. Sonny demanded to know what the hell that thing was. As several coins fell out of the creature's mouth and rolled on the floor, the chest pressed down harder, making Sonny shriek from blinding pain.
Bastard, let go of me, you vile piece of rotten wood.
Instead of doing that, the chest moved closer, forcing Sonny to fall to his knees. Something wet and coarse touched his hand, and a disturbingly long and wide tongue emerged from beneath the golden coins, sliding across his arm and dripping with viscous saliva. Then the tongue moved toward his neck. Sonny stared at the horrid sight in outrage, then screamed, demanding what the spell that was. As the second shadow wrapped itself around his body, gifting him a vast boost in strength. Sonny tried to pull his broken arm out of the abomination's maw, but its bite was just too damn overbearing. All he accomplished was almost knocking himself out from the pain of bone shards scraping against each other. Sonny howled in pain and cursed. As the unnaturally long tongue of the chest almost reached Sonny's neck, he growled, and then commanded the cruel sight to turn into a spear. At the same time, he activated the dark mirror enchantment with a burst of shadow essence, imbuing the silver blade with soul-destroying power. The memory extended inside the creature's mouth, hitting it in the back of the whatever it had instead of a throat. The tip of the spear sunk into the adamantine wood only by a centimeter or two. The wound was by no means serious, but it must have hurt the chest a lot because it suddenly let out a shrill shriek and then spat Sonny's maimed arm out. Sonny fell to the floor and rolled away, then rose to one knee and hissed yes. Before he could celebrate getting his freedom back, however, the chest suddenly swayed, and then rose into the air, revealing a gaunt and revolting body hiding beneath. More coins rolled on the floor. The abomination must have been a masterful contortionist, because at its full height, it was almost 3 meters tall. Sonny had no idea how the creature managed to hide all that bony flesh inside the fake chest, even if the chest was large enough to swallow a human whole. Its long and emaciated limbs unfolded with repulsive cracking sounds, and then it towered menacingly above Sonny, the long tongue dripping with saliva. Sonny cursed, oh, curse it all. Before he could even react, the creature moved one of its long legs and kicked him in the chest with the force of a derailing train. Sonny's body shot back, smashed through the reinforced door of the armored compartment, and rolled into the corridor outside. He tried to groan, but all the air had been knocked out of his lungs by the terrible collision. His skull seemed to be in one piece, as was his spine. Barely. It did feel, however, as though his entire body had recently suffered from being stomped on by a whole herd of elephants. In his disoriented state, Sonny couldn't help but think confusedly. Elephant? What the hell is an elephant? Then, however, all thoughts disappeared from his head, because he noticed the vile creature falling on all fours and then launching itself forward, the lid of the chest rising for another bite. When the abomination landed, though there was nothing to bite into, Sonny had used Shadow Step and fell out of a shadow 10 meters further into the corridor, then landed awkwardly on his broken arm and whimpered, "Oh, damn, that it hurt." The toothy chest hovered in the air for a couple of moments as though bewildered, then slowly turned to face him. Sonny sighed, then picked himself up from the floor and tried to stand up. His first attempt failed. Gritting his teeth and hiding how much pain he was currently experiencing, Sonny threw a furious glance at the creature and growled for it to come there, the bastard. With that, he used the cruel sight to help himself stand up and then pointed the spear at the creature. The chest tilted to the side.
How come it seems as though the bastard is grinning? How can a chest even grin?
But there was no mistaking it. The abomination was mocking him. It became especially apparent after a grating, high-pitched giggle escaped from somewhere inside it. The sound of it was so offensive, both to Sonny's pride and his ears, that he would rather have his arm broken all over again than listen to it. Sonny snapped, asking if it was funny. Sonny smiled, then unhurriedly lowered the spear and thrust it into one of the thick brown vines sprawled on the floorboards in front of him. The abomination's giggle abruptly stopped. It froze and stared at Sonny as though utterly stunned, and then trembled. Sonny taunted that it was not so funny now. A moment later, the entire ship trembled too. Whatever it was that slumbered in the cargo hold of the ancient ship did not like one of its vines being damaged, let alone having its soul cut by a sharp blade. As the whole wreck trembled, a strong gust of warm, pungent wind hit Sonny in the back, tousling his hair. The air became even murkier than it had been before. The chest creature froze, staring at him with something that resembled a mortified expression. Even its tongue stopped swaying in the air and retreated back under the pile of golden coins. Now, it was Sonny's turn to grin. An evil gleam appeared in his eyes. Retrieving the cruel sight, he said,
Goodness gracious, how clumsy of me.
The abomination lingered for a few moments, gave him a hateful look, and turned slightly toward the door of the treasury. Then, however, it halted. Sonny murmured, "Don't tell me." Faced with the terrible danger of facing the awakened master of the wreck, the creature was still hesitating. The prey was right in front of it. To Sonny's misfortune, he and the bizarre monstrosity shared one fundamental character flaw. Both were very, very greedy. Before he could even blink, the abomination suddenly turned back and lunged at him with a shrill giggle rumbling from somewhere in the depths of it. All Sonny could do was spend more essence and use Shadow's step again, appearing on the spot where the creature had been a second ago. As he slipped on the debris of the shattered door and fell, the abomination shot through the air and crushed into the wall of the corridor, pulverizing the wooden boards and getting entangled in the vines covering them. It huffed and puffed, then tried to extricate itself from the mess of glistening vines. However, they wouldn't let go. In fact, as Sonny watched in horror, the whole corridor moved. The reddish-brown mass that it was overgrown with rippled, and the thick vines crawled toward the trapped creature, long thorns suddenly appearing on their vernicose surface. The abomination giggled again, this time nervously, and doubled its efforts to free itself, slashing at the vines with its talons and biting into them with its terrifying teeth. As sickeningly pungent juice flowed into its maw, the creature shuddered. Sonny muttered a frantic string of curses under his breath. Turning on his stomach, Sonny lunged himself forward and rolled into the treasury. Here, there were no vines and no moss. Only 2 empty chests and a scattering of gold coins gleaming on the floor. As he hesitated, thinking of what to do next, something crashed with a deafening noise in the corridor behind him, and a moment later, the tall silhouette of the gaunt monstrosity appeared in the doorway. Sonny's eyes widened, and he brandished the cruel sight, preparing to defend himself. The abomination, however, did not pay him any attention anymore, jumping over Sonny. It landed in the middle of the armored compartment, and then ran as fast as it could toward the breach in the back wall. Without stopping even for a second, it reached the breach and dove through it, escaping the awakening wreck. Sonny followed its escape with his eyes and then blinked. Then his gaze fell on the floor of the treasury. The coins were still there, glinting in the bright sunlight. They didn't disappear or dissipate after the creature had run away. The coins were real. Sonny breathed, "They're real." As the ancient ship shook and trembled, and the mass of vines crawled toward the treasury, Sonny gritted his teeth and lunged toward the coins, grabbing them and pushing them into his pack. He kept muttering to himself, "Real, they're real." He was in such a hurry to gather all the coins that he even cut himself slightly on the piece of mirror that was still stored in the pack. Sonny yelped at the sharp sting. He winced, then continued stuffing coins into the pack. Sonny went on, his voice thick with greedy realization. If these coins are real, then the rest of them inside that damned chest are real too. Perhaps there weren't as many as he had thought, since the chest turned out to have a false everything, but just the top layer that was visible to the naked eyes had to contain 1,000 or more coins at least. As Sonny hunted down the last shiny golden disc left in the treasury, his attention was elsewhere. It was concentrated on his shadow, the one he had hidden in the abomination's own shade when it jumped over him. Now, the shadow was following the bizarre creature as it ran toward the edge of the island, its gangly arms swaying in the air. Sonny expected it to be assaulted by the sailor dolls, but the menacing wood wraiths seemed to be retreating from the wreck themselves. Some even dropped to the ground, turning back into piles of debris. The ground was moving. Sonny remarked with quiet amazement, "Well, what do you know?" He thought that the dolls learned to fall apart and reassemble themselves as a way to combat the crushing, since many nightmare creatures on the Isles had adapted to its harsh reality in one way or another. But maybe this peculiar ability had initially been just the means to hide themselves from the being that inhabited the wreck. In any case, he couldn't let the chest escape, not when 1,000 shadow fragments were hidden inside the abominable thing. Palming the last coin, Sonny threw the pack over his shoulder, then picked up the cruel sight and stood up. A determined expression appeared on his face. The abomination was already halfway to the edge of the island. Sonny called out after it, "Where are you running, bastard?" Diving into the shadows, he expended a large burst of essence and appeared out of his own shadow right in front of the creature. Since he could only use one hand now, the weapon memory had turned back into a short sword. Before the abomination could react, the cruel sight lashed out and bit it into its thigh. The silver blade went all the way through, escaping from the back of it in a rain of black blood. The chest let out a startled shriek, and then the monstrosity tumbled to the ground, rolling over its head and sending pieces of moss and mud flying into the air. The force of its crash was so fearsome that the ground trembled. Or was there another reason? Before Sonny could do anything, brown vines shot from under the moss, wrapping themselves around the body of the bizarre abomination. One of them, however, slid around his leg instead.
Not good.
The vine wasn't as large as some of the ones Sonny had seen back on the ancient ship, but it was still as thick as a man's arm, with curved black thorns protruding from its glistening surface. The vine brought the sickeningly sweet smell with it. Sonny hacked at it with the cruel sight, but barely managed to break the vine's skin. As a fine aerosol of aromatic juice shot into the air, the damned thing moved. His eyes widened. The vine easily shredded the leather boot of the puppeteer's shroud, as though the awakened armor of the fifth tier was made out of tissue paper. Before the sharp thorns could saw off his foot, however, Sonny cursed and brought the cruel sight down once more, this time augmenting the silver blade with both of his shadows. The short sword hacked through the vine, severing the stretch of it that was wrapped around Sonny's leg. The rest of it didn't like being cut one bit. Surging forward, it aimed at his torso. Several more appeared from beneath the most it shot at Sonny too. However, now that nothing was holding him, he could finally use Shadow Step again. Before the vines reached his body, Sonny turned into a shadow, safe and sound in their tranquil embrace of the darkness. For now, at least. He slid a few meters away and stared at the struggling abomination. The creature was entangled by several thick vines, which moved across its body, leaving bloody trails on it. Sparks flew as the black thorns scraped fruitlessly across the adamantine surface of the wooden chest, though it seemed to be much tougher than the rest of the creature's body. The monstrosity gathered its limbs underneath it, then pushed with all its might, trying to stand up. An angry shriek escaped from its maw. The vines were trying to hold it down, but either they were much weaker here, far away from the wreck, or the abomination was much stronger than Sunny had thought. It raised to its knees, then lashed out with its talons, ripping two of the vines apart. Suddenly liberated, the monstrosity crawled from underneath the remaining vines and then dashed toward the edge of the island on all fours. Sunny hissed. Sunny spat a sharp curse. Why couldn't it just lay still and die? He escaped the shadow and ran after the unreasonably swift abomination. But it was too late. Just a few moments later, the bizarre creature reached the very edge of the island and jumped off of it without slowing even for a moment. The lid of the chest clicked close as it plummeted down. Sunny snarled in disbelief. What the hell? Sunny reached the edge a few seconds later and froze as he looked down. A grim expression appeared on his face. Some distance below, a gargantuan heavenly chain escaped from the mouth of a stone structure similar to the one Sunny had seen on the other side of the island. This one was slightly different, though, mainly because both of the massive stone pillars had broken and collapsed a long time ago. The chain itself was different too. Sunny had never seen such a thing on the chained isles. It seemed sick somehow, weakened. The chain was covered in rust, its iron links dim and lifeless, robbed of their usual sense of indestructible stability. This one was rather long, stretching for good 10 kilometers or so into the distance. Because the shipwreck island continued to descend, it was slightly angled upward. Sunny could see a relatively small isle on the other end of the chain, far into the distance. And everywhere in between, grotesque chain worms were crawling all other the weakened heavenly chain. Not that Sunny saw them alive. He understood that he had underestimated just how disturbing these creatures were. With their long serpentine tails, human-like torsos, and long muzzles that brimmed with dagger-like fangs, the demons looked like misshapen maggots devouring the dying chain. Or maybe it was already dead, and they were simply feasting on its corpse. Some were thin like the one Sunny had seen before, some engorged on the rusty iron and bloated beyond any reasonable measure, towering above the damaged chain like small hills of flesh. The scales on the latter ones looked like they were now made out of steel and shined as they reflected the sunlight. Those who had not satiated their hunger yet were much thinner and flew around, resembling giant metal dragonflies. Crap! The damned chest creature landed directly on the rusted heavenly chain, gathered its long limbs, and dashed away from the shipwreck island, swaying dangerously as it went, from time to time. It fell to all fours and launched itself into the air, jumping from one link to another. It wasn't long before the bizarre abomination encountered a chain worm. The winged creature lunged at it, only to be kicked in the muzzle and have one of its wings ruthlessly torn apart. The chest creature tossed the maimed chain worm back toward the island, where its body was suddenly grabbed by a long root that lazily extended from the darkness of the dark side, then disappeared from view. The abomination took in the terrible sight, giggled, then turned around and continued running away. Sunny hesitated. His prize was getting away, but the small island he could see in the distance had to be the Twisted Rock, the isle directly bordering the tier. There would be no more land to escape to if he went there, and the only chain that connected Twisted Rock to the chained isles was currently being devoured by the demonic worms. It didn't seem to be on the verge of collapse just yet, however. How would Sunny know? It's not like he had seen a heavenly chain break before. Perhaps it was time to give up on his pursuit and turn back. He lingered on the very edge of the island, sensing brown vines crawling closer and closer. Risk it all or retreat and lose the chance to get his hands on the miraculous treasure forever. Nephi's was about to become a devil in just a few days. No matter what decision he was going to make, he had to make it right now. In the end, Sunny had to silence his avarice and consider the situation objectively. Going after the bizarre abomination posed a huge risk, but it also promised a huge reward. In the end, what made him decide was not greed, emotions, or even rational thought. It was his intuition. For whatever reason, Sunny felt a strong aversion to the idea of turning back. It was as though Twisted Rock exerted an invisible pull on him, drawing him closer. He had never experienced something like this, at least not to this degree. He knew that his intuition was not a simple thing. It was connected to the fated attribute and the special properties his eyes had inherited from Weaver. Somehow, Sonny was capable of perceiving the trembling of the strings of fate around him from time to time. Considering how strong his intuition was pushing him toward the twisted rock, something out there had to be of utmost importance to his fate, or at least have a connection to it. Fine, let's get those coins. With a grim expression, Sonny summoned the dark wing and dove into the empty abyss of the skies. Sonny glided through the skies, tensely observing the underside of the shipwreck island through the eyes of his shadow. The chain ahead of him was teeming with a swarm of fallen demons, but behind him, he didn't even want to know what the thing hiding in the darkness was. One thing became clear, though, and it was why none of the chain worms had tried to devour the iron giant that swayed in the wreckage of a broken heavenly chain, or rather, had succeeded in trying to bite a piece out of him. The dead colossus was like cheese in the mousetrap, attracting these vile creatures into the range at which the being that dwelled in the perpetual darkness could catch them. Sonny was sure that many chain worms had attempted to feast on the iron giant, but ended up being the feast instead. Currently, he was trying to avoid the same fate. Luckily, the dark wing allowed him to glide diagonally away from the shipwreck island instead of plunging straight down, avoiding the attack range of the terrifying being. He reached the chain without attracting the attention of the bottom dweller and instantly became a shadow hiding on its underside. Waiting for a few moments, Sonny studied the length of the heavenly tether in front of him. Not too bad. A large section of the unusually long chain hung low, reaching the sky below. He would be able to ride most of it without being noticed by the chain worms. The last stretch of it, though. Sonny was going to have to use Shadow Step to jump from shadow to shadow if he wanted to avoid having to fight a swarm of the fallen demons. The problem was that his reserves of shadow essence were already running low. Except for the short walk across the hull of the ancient ship, Sonny had no chance to really replenish it. In the meantime, he had used a lot to get to the wreck, fight the damnable chest abomination, and pursue it. Chances were he would reach the twisted rock with no essence to spare whatsoever. How was he even going to kill the vile chest, especially with one of his arms broken? He hesitated for a bit, then rushed forward, swiftly reaching the section of the chain submerged into the sky below and continuing to fly through the darkness once there. To avoid tempting fate, Sonny remained on the underside of the gargantuan tether, where there were way fewer worms crawling around. He did, however, encounter several, and saw up close how they were tearing into the rusting iron of the chain as he silently flew past. The sight of it was simultaneously disturbing, fascinating, and strangely sad. Sonny murmured, "All things must come to an end, I guess." Even as seemingly eternal as the miraculous heavenly chains. Soon, he caught up with the chest creature and followed it from the shadows. The bizarre monstrosity was still running as fast as it could, jumping from link to link, and using its long, gangly limbs to keep balance. From time to time, it got into a short and vicious fight with one of the chain worms and either left them severely wounded, or promptly escaped with a ghastly wound or two of its own. By now, its grating giggles grew somewhat miserable, as well as menacingly angry. Sonny observed its fighting habits, thinking about how to deal with it best. At the same time, he was meticulously calculating the amount of shadow essence he would have to spend across the last section of the way to the twisted rock, trying to find a way to keep his reserves as high as possible. His calculations, thought, had turned out to be for naught. When both Sonny and the chest monstrosity were about halfway to the small island, a dreadful sound reached their ears. It was the rattling of the chain. Sonny froze for a moment, then glanced toward the goal of this journey. Sonny muttered a dismayed, "Oh no." The twisted rock had entered its ascent phase, and was now rising quickly into the sky.
Curse it all.
Sonny remembered thinking that he was in luck today and couldn't help but growl. Mentally, of course, since he had no vocal cords currently. Where the hell was this supposed luck? The fact that the twisted rock was ascending meant two things for him. One was that he would have to act fast and try to kill the chest creature before the crushing became too terrible, or somehow obliterate the damned thing while being weighed down by it. The second was that the position of the heavenly chain was swiftly shifting, making it so that the stretch of it submerged into the sky below was becoming shorter and shorter. This meant that he would have to spend much more essence to reach the island without attracting the attention of the swarm of chain worms, and he didn't have a lot of essence to spare to begin with. Sunny snarled a bitter, "Damn it." As the angle of the chain increased and the bizarre monstrosity swayed, then fell on all fours and rushed forward even faster, Sunny tried to deal with the resentment growing in his heart and followed it. Was my intuition wrong? Things didn't seem too good for him right now. Soon, the two of them emerged from the darkness of the sky below and saw the sunlight again. The chest creature seemed indifferent to it, but to Sunny it was an ill omen. Out here in the sunlit expanse of the sky above, the heavenly chain was not covered in an uninterrupted layer of shadows anymore. That meant that he couldn't move through it unobstructed. Instead, Sunny had to either step from one shadow to another, if they were close enough, or send his own forward and make use of it to jump over long stretches of brightly lit parts of the heavenly tether. Sunny grumbled, "Damn it." Knowing that there was no other choice now, Sunny burned through his essence in order to not fall behind the rushing monstrosity. Soon, his reserves grew dangerously low. It was still enough to reach the twisted rock, probably, but once there, he would have to fight while both of his cores were nearly empty. That meant no bursts of speed, strength, and resilience that he had already gotten used to. No access to active enchantment like the Dark Mirror. No more using Shadow Step to escape dangerous situations, at least for a while. And added to all that, one of his arms was broken and completely useless. Oh, and there was also the crushing. If Sunny had teeth in his shadow form, or a mouth for that matter, he would have gritted them right now. Full of dark emotions, he thought. Doesn't matter. I'm getting these coins even if it kills me. Soon, the vile creature drew close to the twisted rock. It crouched near the vertical stone wall of the floating island, giggled, and then suddenly shot upward, jumping no less than 20 meters high. Its talons pierced the weathered stone, and the abomination nimbly climbed up, soon disappearing from view. Far below, on the rusted surface of the damaged heavenly chain, a hunched human figure suddenly appeared from the deep shadows. Sunny felt the chain sway as the island rose higher and higher, then looked up with a dark expression. In this direction, Twisted Rock was the last piece of land before the empty expanse of the tier. It also only had one iron tether connecting it to the rest of the chained isles, so now that the bizarre monstrosity was up there, it had nowhere else to run. With a pained grimace, Sunny summoned the Moonlight Shard, cut one of the straps off his pack, then tied it around his neck to create a makeshift sling for his broken arm. He was going to have to set the bones and make a proper splint later, but for now, this was going to have to do. With his arm secured and cradled against his chest, Sunny waited a few seconds for the sharp pain to subside, then activated the dark wing and used the prowling thorn to fly up the overhanging slope of the stone island. The dragonfly cloak only allowed him to levitate if there was a surface beneath it to support the enchantment. If there wasn't, he was only able to slowly glide down instead of falling without any control. So, to travel up, he had to either push off of something or pull himself towards something. The prowling thorn made that process easier. Due to the burden of the early stages of the crushing, Sunny had to exert more strength than usual to propel himself upward. After using the heavy kunai to do so several times, he finally crested the edge of the Twisted Rock and soared a few meters above it. The Twisted Rock was a dreadful and miserable place. The island was rather small, and all of its surface was nothing but an uneven expanse of dark stone. That stone, however, looked really strange. It was as though once a long time ago it had been melted by unimaginable heat and then abruptly solidified again, creating strange shapes and swirls. Here and there, blackened bones protruded from the molten stone, telling the tale of countless humans and beasts who had drowned in that scorching inferno. The sight of them was eerie and disturbing, like something torn from the actual hell. Thrown down by the crushing, Sunny landed heavily on the dark stone and swayed, then supported himself with the shaft of the cruel sight. His graceless arrival made enough noise to attract the attention of the chest fiend, who was crouching a dozen or so meters away. The creature froze, then turned around and faced him. Sunny scowled. A mangled corpse of a chain worm was hanging from beneath the half-closed lid of the chest. As the creature turned, the tail and claws of the dead fallen demon scraped across the molten stone. The bizarre abomination stared at Sunny for a few moments, then opened its maw and swallowed the remainder of the chain worm whole. Despite the fact that the demon was at least 5 times bigger than the chest that served the fiend as the head, it somehow disappeared inside without leaving a trace. The creature licked the blood off its sharp teeth and giggled. This time, its laugh sounded rather hateful. A cold smile appeared on Sunny's lips. Sunny said, "Right back at you, bastard." As the fiend rose to its feet, towering above Sunny menacingly at full 3 meters of height, the cruel sight shifted and turned into a somber shortsword. Its silver blade gleamed, seemingly absorbing the bright sunlight. The heavenly chain rattled below, and as its rusted links scraped against each other, the twisted rock continued to ascend. The smile disappeared from Sunny's face. Staring at the gluttonous abomination, he couldn't help but feel a bit of fear. The thing was tall, fast, and incredibly strong. Much stronger than he was, especially now that his reserves of shadow essence were almost completely drained. Despite the fact that it was heavily wounded, both by his sword and by the claws of the chain worms, it still appeared agile, vigorous, and full of murderous spite. However, this fight was not going to be as suicidal as it might have seemed. There were 3 main reasons why Sunny felt confident in his chances of defeating the bizarre abomination. The first one was hanging on a thread tied around his neck. It was a beautiful amulet in the form of a crimson flower, the blood blossom. The fiend was bleeding heavily from the deep cut on its thigh, which had been left there by the sharp blade of the cruel sight, and from a multitude of ugly wounds delivered to the gaunt body of the monstrosity by the chain worms it had fought while traversing the heavenly chain. The more black blood flowed from those wounds, the more the morbid charm memory enhanced both the puppeteer's shroud and the cruel sight, as well as any other memory Sunny would want to use. The second reason was rather simple, and it was the fundamental difference between the two of them. The abomination might have been stronger and faster than Sunny, but it lacked his combat skill and insight. As long as the gap in power was not absolutely overwhelming, a polished technique could turn the tide of any battle. More than that, fighting things that were bigger and more powerful than him was more or less Sunny's specialty by now. However, the third reason was the most important, and the one he hoped to exploit the most. Yes, the fiend was stronger than Sunny, but it was also much larger and heavier than him. That meant that it was going to be affected by the crushing much more. No matter how bad it was going to get for Sunny, it was going to be many times worse for the towering abomination. Out here on the chained isles, being small and lithe was sometimes a great advantage. Feeling the burden of the crushing pressing down on him more and more, Sunny raised his sword and aimed it at the bizarre fiend. Let's see which one of us is going to break first.